উপস্থিত আলোচকবৃন্দ এবং অতিথিদেরকে স্বাগত জানাচ্ছি আজকের বইয়ের আড্ডায়। আজকে আমরা সমবেত হয়েছি অধ্যাপক রেহমান সোবহানের আত্মজীবনী আনট্রাঙ্কুইল রেকলেকশনের 2টি খণ্ড নিয়ে আলোচনা শুনতে। এই 2 খণ্ডের প্রথম খণ্ডটির নাম দ্য ইয়ার্স অফ ফুলফিলমেন্ট এবং দ্বিতীয় খণ্ডটির নাম ফ্রম ডন টু ডার্কনেস। আজকের আয়োজনে আমাদের মাঝে উপস্থিত আছেন সেন্টার অফ পলিসি ডায়ালগ সিপিডি এর চেয়ারম্যান অধ্যাপক রেহমান সোবহান এবং ওয়ার্ল্ড ব্যাংকের সাবেক অর্থনীতিবিদ ডক্টর আখতার মাহমুদ। শুরুতেই আমি অনুরোধ করব দি ইউনিভার্সিটি প্রেস লিমিটেডের ব্যবস্থাপনা পরিচালক মাহরুক মহিউদ্দিনকে শুভেচ্ছা বক্তব্য প্রদানের জন্য।
আসসালামু আলাইকুম। আমি খুবই দুঃখিত আমার ভয়েসের জন্য। আজকে আলোচনা ইংরেজিতেই হবে। আমরা আপনাদের সকলকে স্বাগত জানাচ্ছি আমাদের আজকে অফিসে, ইউপিএল এর অফিসে এই অনুষ্ঠানে। দুঃখিত। আমি আজকে আমন্ত্রণ জানাচ্ছি, স্বাগত জানাচ্ছি আপনাদের সকলকে যারা আজকে এখানে উপস্থিত হয়েছেন। সকলে আমাদের সম্মানিত গুরুজন এবং আমাদের বন্ধুস্থানীয় অনেকে এসছেন এবং আমাদের সম্মানিত দুজন আলোচক, লেখক রেহমান সোবহান এবং আজকে যিনি আলোচনা করবেন সৈয়দ আখতার মাহমুদ। আজকে এই বই নিয়ে আসলে বোধহয় প্রায় দ্বিতীয় বা তৃতীয় কিংবা চতুর্থ আলোচনা হতে পারে এবং দুটো বই একসাথে বোধহয় এই প্রথম হচ্ছে। দুটো বই আলাদা করে বেশ অনেকবারই আলোচনা হয়েছে এবং শেষবার আমরা ঢাকা লিট ফেস্টে আখতার মাহমুদ ভাইয়ের সাথেই আরেকটা কনভারসেশন হয়েছিল। তো সেটারই সূত্র ধরে আমরা মনে করেছিলাম যে দুটো বইকে একসাথে আমরা যেহেতু নতুন করে প্রেজেন্ট করছি, দুটো বই সেইজ থেকে আগে প্রকাশিত হয়েছিল, এখন ইউপিএল থেকেই দুটো বই আমরা প্রকাশ করছি এবং আশা করছি সামনে বাংলা ভাষায়ও দুটো বই আমরা আমাদের পাঠকদের জন্য নিয়ে আসতে পারবো এবং আমরা অপেক্ষা করছি স্যারের তৃতীয় ভলিউমটার জন্য। তৃতীয় ভলিউমটা হলে তখন আমরা ওনার পূর্ণাঙ্গ মেমোয়ারের একটা কালেকশন পাবো এবং সেটা শুধুমাত্র তার জীবনের সাক্ষ্য না, এটা আমাদের দেশের ইতিহাসের একটা বড় সাক্ষ্য হিসেবে আমাদের পাঠকদের জন্য থাকবে। তো আমি খুব কথা বাড়াবো না, আমি আন্তরিকভাবে সকলকে স্বাগত জানাচ্ছি। আপনারা আজকে সমবেত হয়েছেন শুধু এখানে না, আমাদের জুমে বেশ কয়েকজন যুক্ত হচ্ছেন এবং ফেসবুকে লাইভ হচ্ছে। তো আমরা আলোচনায় চলে যাই। আজকে একটু দীর্ঘ আলোচনা হবে যেহেতু দুটো বই এবং আমার মনে হয় অনেক কিছু জানবার আছে। হয়তো বইয়ের বাইরেও কিছু কিছু প্রসঙ্গ আখতার ভাই তুলে নিয়ে আসতে পারবেন আলোচনার মধ্য দিয়ে। আবারও অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ আপনাদেরকে সময় দেওয়ার জন্য এবং আমরা একটি উপভোগ্য আলোচনার জন্য অপেক্ষা করছি। মেনি থ্যাঙ্কস।
মাহরুক, আপনাকে এবং ইউপিএলকে ধন্যবাদ এই অনুষ্ঠানটি আয়োজন করবার জন্য এবং আমাকে এখানে অংশগ্রহণ করবার সুযোগ করবার জন্য। আপনি যেমনটি বললেন এটা ইংরেজিতেই হবে। সো আই লাইক টু ওয়েলকাম অল অফ ইউ। Thanks very much for coming. We will have what looks like, what promises to be a very stimulating and perhaps a very candid conversation with Professor Rehman Sobhan. We will actually take a journey starting from his childhood, and gradually we will first move in a somewhat northwesterly direction to Darjeeling and Lahore and then to Cambridge, and then we'll turn back in an eastwardly direction and come all the way to Dhaka. But then again, there will be travels all over the world that Professor Sobhan had made, and we will touch upon some of those travels. The structure that we have agreed is that we will devote the first 40 minutes to a conversation on the first volume, which covers the period from his birth to 31st December 1971, the day he returns to Dhaka. And the second volume starts actually from the 1st of January 1972 and ends towards the end of 1975. So the first 40 minutes is a conversation between Professor Sobhan and me, and then we'll devote about 20 minutes to opening up the floor for your comments and questions, and then we'll go on to the second volume and we'll follow the same structure. So we are looking forward to at least a couple of hours of very stimulating conversation here. Well, Professor Sobhan, welcome. And an advance happy birthday. I believe in 3 days' time you'll be turning 89. So happy birthday for that. We'll start with your childhood. And in the volume, I encountered an acronym and a phrase. The acronym is DNF, and the phrase is the Khandakars of Murshidabad. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, before I respond, I would like to thank Maruf and UPL for publishing these 2 volumes. I've had a long relationship with UPL going back to Muhyiddin, and I'm happy that this relationship has been renewed through the republication of these 2 volumes. These were originally published by Sage in India, but we felt that this did not have enough access to readers in Bangladesh, and it's very important, therefore, that Maruf has agreed to go ahead with this publication. So thank you again. Now to get back to that, well, DNF to begin with is very simple. It is the acronym for the Dhaka Nawab family. The Dhaka Nawab family were part of my mother's sort of ancestral inheritance. 50% were inheritance because the other part was from Lucknow. And I write in the volume about that inheritance which began in Kashmir, but they began not as Nawabs, but just as businessmen who came and settled in Begum Bazar in Dhaka and made their fortunes. And as with many people who acquire titles, I mean, the route to titles is to be a good capitalist. And I think that's the way the family actually did its progression. As far as the Murshidabad is concerned, the Khunkars were a family which settled in Murshidabad, I suppose, somewhere around the 17th or 18th century. And we have been there ever since. In fact, we still have family members living in Murshidabad. We narrowly escaped being part of Pakistan because in the first drawing of the partition boundary by Radcliffe, Murshidabad was in fact included in Pakistan because it had a Muslim majority. It was very much a Muslim majority district. But there was a trade-off in Khulna, which was a Hindu majority area, was ceded to Pakistan, and Murshidabad became part of India. So we have retained connections. Most of our family basically took the route of becoming professionals. So they put a strong emphasis on education, and my father's generation all went into public service. In my generation, we retreated from public service. And in my son's generation, of course, they completely abandoned it. So in fact, there has been a retreat from public service to, you may say, civil society.
Well, from my family's point of view, we are grateful that the transaction happened that way because my father's family is from Khulna.
Yes, you might have been an Indian citizen.
Yes. Now, I had heard this, I thought it was a quote from your mother-in-law, Shahista Ikramullah, but in the book you cite your brother-in-law's making
My
that quote.
brother-in-law.
I'll still, I found your mother-in-law's quote or this ascribed quote as a little bit more colorful, so I'll say it like that. So apparently Mrs. Ikramullah said once that I've got 3 sons-in-law. One is within the law, one is above the law, which is Prince Hassan, and the other is an outlaw. Now, it seems that your aversion to authority started at a very young age. There's a very interesting anecdote about the day your mother, when you were 3 years old, left you at the school. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, I was an outlaw in 1971, quite literally, in the sense that I was what is known as a proclaimed offender by the Pakistan government. I don't accept necessarily that I've been an outlaw all my life in the legal sense of the term, though in the political sense, I suppose I have remained more or less on the dissenting side of the political divide in most cases, not always. The origins, of course, of that was I've often wondered how far it was apocryphal or how far it was a valid memory in my mind that when I was first taken to school by my mother at the age of 3 to Loreto House in Kolkata, which was actually a girls' school, and only boys could stay there up to the end of kindergarten. And I wasn't quite sure why I went there or why I was taken there, but when my mother left me, I wanted to go after her, and when the teacher tried to restrain me, I actually bit her on the wrist. Because of that, I was apparently locked up in a room and kept there. So I like to think that I was, you may say, a prisoner of conscience at that moment of time because I was denied the liberty of, in fact, going home with my mother.
And your mother was quite a formidable lady, wasn't she?
She was indeed, yes.
And in fact, it seems that the 3 most important women in your life, and one of them is here, were all formidable personalities, maybe in different ways. And we'd like to know about the way they shaped the Rehman Sobhan that we have seen.
Well, to begin with, my mother was a very important person because she essentially was determined that I should get the best education. She took much more interest in my education than my father did. I mean, my father just paid the bills. But she basically saw to it that I went first to St. Paul's School in Darjeeling, and then later on, when I could not do my HSC in St. Paul's because they had no provision, then she took me all the way to HSN College in Lahore, which meant that from being an Indian citizen, I then evolved into being a Pakistani citizen, but more on grounds of continuing my educational progression rather than from out of any change in nationality. But that happened incidentally. But she again also influenced various other aspects of my life. She was a person with a variety of interests, but took a lot of interest in the way we viewed life and gave me some lifelong tastes, including watching cinema. My mother was a great lover of going to movies. And in fact, from the age of 3, I was being taken by her to watch movies, and I have developed that passion even to this day. Other ladies, Salma, of course, I have written about. She was an important person, the mother of my children. She was the person with whom we first made our life together, me developing professionally, financially constrained in all matters, but she was willing to be there. She herself was teaching law at Dhaka University at that time, somewhat reluctantly, because at that time she was quite happy to be a homemaker, but we felt that she should in fact become a university teacher, both for professional reasons and out of financial necessity. And of course, then she went on to chalk out her own destiny through I Know Shalish Kendro. Hamida, her co-founder, is sitting over here, and she led a different sort of life altogether. Raunak, who is here, was a person who I knew long, long before we got married, uh, going back to 1970 when she had just graduated from Harvard, as a person with a very strong personality and very defined views. And we spent the next 30 years or so arguing over many things and enjoying many things together. But because we had shared academic interests, I used to read her works, she used to read mine. That's how, in a way, we came together. And of course, we hadn't anticipated that our destinies would cross, but there it is. And hereby, 20 years later, with a new, you may say, a sort of new tenure in life, thanks to her.
And you were a very good boxer, apparently, at St. Paul's. You were a champion boxer.
Yes.
And you were very much into sports.
Yes,
Much
indeed.
more than academics, I believe, or both.
Well, I'm now more engaged in spectator sports, and I'm very fond of watching football, cricket. Those are the main things I have the time to watch, tennis sometimes. And I read about it, but then I read about many things. But the interest which I developed more as a person who was engaged in sports, and then later I used to watch it live. I went to Wimbledon, I went to see cricket at Lord's in the Oval, and this was an interest which has remained with me and which I have passed on to my sons, who are also good sportsmen and also great spectator watchers themselves.
So after HSN, you were getting ready to go abroad, and you said that at that age, you really did not have much of an idea of what you're going to do with your life. It's a bit difficult for us to believe that Rehman Sobhan would ever be in that state where he doesn't quite know what he wants to do with his life. But your father had some idea. He had bought by that time some equity share in a tannery, and he thought a good vocation for you would be, or at least to learn the tannery business. And when you went to London, was that your original objective?
Well, in theory, it was. I mean, I'm quite surprised as to how indifferent I was at that particular stage about having a university education. I was a pretty good student by any standards throughout my school days at St. Paul's and in HSN, and virtually all my contemporaries were going to university. My father had the peculiar idea that I should then be trained and learn something about the leather business. Of course, when I went to England, I found I had little interest in that. And with some encouragement from my cousins Kamal Hussain and Qaisar Murshid, who were both, Qaisar was going up to Oxford, Kamal was in university in the United States at Notre Dame University. I then decided this is really where I should be, and that's where I took the autonomous decision, independent of my father, that I wanted to join university, and took some initiatives and exercised some patronage in that direction to get into Cambridge, but then eventually found my way into Trinity Hall, Cambridge in October 1953. And so this was a decision entirely taken on my own initiative without consulting my father. Fortunately, he went along with the idea because he would have had to pay the bills.
So you sort of abandoned the leather industry, but the industry never abandoned you. So a few years later, I'm jumping a bit, but a few years later, we see Rehman Sobhan in his mid-20s becoming the president of the Pakistan Leather Association.
Yes,
Going on a trip to East Asia.
that's right.
Well, maybe you can tell us a bit about that, and we'll come back to Cambridge.
Well, actually, it was very interesting because when I came back to Dhaka and became a teacher of Dhaka University, I was left with the responsibility of looking after my father's interests in Dhaka tanneries, which at that time was the biggest and most modern tannery in East Pakistan. It was preceded the A.K. Khan investment in the tannery industry. My father at that time was serving the Awami League government under Mr. Sohrawardy, and he had been invited by Mr. Sohrawardy as Prime Minister to come over to Karachi and become the chairman of the Karachi Development Authority. And so he then expected me, age 22, to go to Dhaka and look after his business interests over there. So I had this peculiar life. I would come to Dhaka University to teach economics in the university from 9 to 1. And then after doing my classes and tutorials, I never missed a single class or a single tutorial. We had 6 hours of lectures and 6 hours of tutorials. Then after having some samosas at the canteen and having conversations with Sarwar Murshid and Professor Razak, I would then drive off to Armani Tola, which was the head office of Dhaka Tanneries, and occasionally then go down to Hazaribagh to see what was going on in the factory over there. But at the end of the day, this dual life was not at all very satisfactory. And when my father prematurely passed away in 1962, just after my marriage, Salma then told me that this is an absurd way to live your life. You better make up your mind whether you want to be a university teacher and an academic, or do you want to be a businessman? And so I was quite clear that I did not want to be a businessman, and I then virtually abandoned all my interests in because since my father was no longer there, and I had no sense of obligation that I should go on looking after his interests. So I became a full-time academic and a politically oriented academic virtually from the time that my father passed away.
Well, we'll come to that, but let's go back to Cambridge. And there is a chapter here where you say Cambridge, the transformative years. And often it is the age where people get transformed, and we'd like to know the way in which you got transformed. And one of the things we know, you say that your introduction to radical ideas, radical politics, leftist politics happened around that time, if I'm not mistaken. But it was not because you read Marx or Lenin's, it was Mr. Nehru who inspired you. How was that?
Okay. Well, I must say that up to the time I went up to Cambridge, I was a reasonably well-read person and did a lot of reading. I was academic. I was politically quite illiterate, and much of what was going on in and around me in Pakistan was going over my head, and I was not taking much interest in it. It was only in those 9 months when I was in London, in this very peculiar status of training to be an expert in the leather business, that I then began going to the local library and reading. And one of the books I read was the 2 volumes of Nehru's. One was his autobiography, and one was Discovery of India. And what impressed me in those 2 volumes was that here was a person coming from a very elite background, because the Nehru family was, of course, part of the elite at that time. And he then, in Cambridge, and after that, then developed this very progressive, what you may say, a democratic socialist consciousness, which took him into the independence struggle for India, but where he also had a strong belief that independent India was move away from its feudal inheritance and was move towards a sort of constructing a socialistic society within a democratic framework. And I was very impressed with this transition, both from his class background and the way his thinking actually evolved. So that was my first interest in socialism. My second interest was a weekly called The New Statesman. It was, again, not a Marxist and far left weekly. It was really a weekly which reflected the left wing of the Labour Party in terms of its sort of ideological orientation. And that also appealed to me. I found that when I was looking at Marxist thinking and progressive thinking, while I read Marx and some of the more sort of left-wing literature coming out of the relevant publishing houses. The orthodoxies did not impress me very strongly at that time. But the idea of progressive, more egalitarian society moved me very strongly. And of course, then the relationships which I built up in Cambridge with people like Omar Hossain, who was much more to the left of me at that particular time, and my attendance at meetings of the Labour Club and the Socialist Society further motivated my consciousness. Strangely enough, one of my great partners in this adventure was the son of one of Pakistan's biggest landlords, Mia Iftikharuddin. He was known as the Red Landlord of Pakistan. He was, as I said, a very wealthy landlord, but he was part of the left wing of the Congress before partition. He founded the left-wing Pakistan Times and edited by Faiz Ahmad Faiz and Mazhar Ali Khan, father of Tariq Ali. And he then also was founder of what was a left-wing political party. So his son inherited all these ideas, but full of the feudal values which his father had bequeathed him, though he was even more of a feudal than his father was. But we constituted, you may say, the left wing of the Pakistan community over there. And this in practice meant that when visiting ministers or VIPs came to address us, we would then sort of go and heckle them. And I remember taking particular people to task about the whole dismissal of the Jukto Front government after the elections, and then joining the Baghdad Pact, pro-American Baghdad Pact in Seattle, and organizing debates to this effect. So these were elements of my left-wing movement, both through my relationships, then my political engagements in the political societies and the Majlis, where I was the president at the Pakistan Society, and my particular relationships with particular people.
And you developed a set of very, very good lifetime friendships. Omar Hossain you just mentioned, and then there was Manmohan Singh, Jagdish Bhagwati, Mahbubul Haq, and Lal Jawahardena. It's almost like a mini SARC, actually, except for Nepal and Bhutan. You had a very good South Asian representation. And you had other networks of friends that you had developed. Now, the good thing about you is that you maintained these relationships, you maintained these acquaintances and networks, which must have given you a lot of personal pleasure and sense of fulfillment. But I think they also came handy at certain times. For example, in 1971, when you were crisscrossing the globe, or at least the western part of the globe, canvassing for Bangladesh, a lot of these friendships must have helped open the doors in India, in England, in America, and elsewhere, wasn't it?
Well, up to a point, certainly. But not all the relationships were, you may say, on the same political wavelength. I mean, for example, Jagdish Bhagwati was a much more market-oriented person. And whilst I was friendly with him, I was not close to him. Mahbubul Haq, I knew in Cambridge. He did not politically engage myself, but ironically, in Pakistan, he became one of our principal antagonists, because he was then in the Planning Commission, and was meant to be the bright young star of the Pakistan Planning Commission, and played a very formative role in the designing and strategizing of the Ayub Khan economic policies. So we in Dhaka University were engaged with him in a series of political debates or debates on the state of the economy. On the other hand, we remained good personal friends, because if I came to Karachi and criticized him in a seminar, I would then have dinner with him at his home in the evening. So the personal relationship remained. The person, of course, with whom I was politically closer, intellectually, and in the way in which he looked at economics much closer, was naturally Amartya Sen. As I said, he was much more to the left at that time. He had been president of the Presidency College Union, which was a very pro-communist entity. I think in his memoir he tries to distance himself a bit from the more radical perspective that he held at that particular time. But my understanding of his consciousness is that he was both theoretically and in terms of his worldview much more oriented to the left at that time. But he was a great source of education for me, for understanding the nature of what was socialist economics, about Marxism, about the way in which the world political economy was structured.
And then you finish your undergraduate studies at Cambridge and you decide to come back to Pakistan. But the interesting choice you made was to come and settle in Dhaka, a city that you had barely stayed in. You mentioned somewhere that you had probably in your whole life till then spent not more than a week or 2 weeks in Dhaka, and yet that was the place you wanted to be.
That's right. I think when I was leaving Cambridge with the idea that I wanted to be engaged in policy making, but also I wanted to be politically involved. And when I looked around the world, the only place I could in practice be politically involved was the then East Pakistan, because both in terms of its social composition, the way in which the political thinking was evolving there, the sense of conflict with the central government of Pakistan. So I took a political decision to, in fact, come to Dhaka. And I turned down a job opportunity to become a reader in economics at Peshawar University. On the basis of my results, a Canadian chair of the department in Peshawar offered me a salary of 800 rupees at that time. I was then not yet 22. To in fact go to Peshawar, but I said that I've decided I'm going to make my life in Dhaka, and this is where I came. And of course, originally I wanted to get into the planning department because the East Pakistan Awami League was then in power. Akhtar Rehman was then the chief minister at that time. Bongo Bandhu was the minister for commerce, labor, and industries. And I came here, but ended up at Dhaka University. So that was, in a way, a choice of coming here, in a way, an ideological choice for proclaiming a Bengali Bangladeshi identity.
Had you gone to Peshawar, you probably would have had Akhlaqur Rahman as a colleague.
I
He was
would
there?
indeed, because Akhlaqur Rahman, because of his extreme left-wing views, was unemployable at Dhaka University. But somehow the Pathans were more willing to accommodate him over there. So he was also a reader in economics. And this reflected this very enlightened Canadian who headed the department. He was willing to get hold of two Bengalis to, in fact, lead the economics department in Peshawar. And he would have been good company because Akhlaq was a great character.
And initially, at least for a while, you were staying with Khaja Nazimuddin, who is your great
My Nana.
Nana, your Nana. And one day he invites a couple of Awami League politicians and who are introduced, or you're introduced to them. They're impressed by your academic qualifications and your interest in public service, but otherwise they don't really, as we say in Bangla, give you much patta that day. One of them was Bongo Bandhu, which whom, of course, you then had a very, very close relationship, which we'll come to later. But I found that anecdote very interesting. Your first encounter with Bongo Bandhu, and the other gentleman was Ataur Rahman Khan.
Well, actually, there is a postscript to that story. Whilst Bongo Bandhu and Akhtar Rehman were invited to dinner by Khaja Nazimuddin, I was in fact staying with him at that particular time because I had no fixed abode. We met and he took cognizance of me as England returned, but not much more. But when he did take notice of me a few days later, was when I went to meet Arif Iftikhar's father, Mian Iftikharuddin. He had come over to participate in the founding of the National Awami Party being set up by Maulana Bhashani. was really breaking away from the Awami League because of the fact that they were not standing by their commitment to withdraw from the pacts, and he also felt that the Awami League was not moving as strongly towards the autonomy to which they had committed. So they broke away and they were forming a left-wing political alliance with some of the progressive and provincial and nationalist parties of West Pakistan, of which Mia Iftikharuddin was one of them. So Mia Iftikharuddin had come to Dhaka, and then when he was going to attend the meeting, he was attacked by some of the hoodlums of the government at that time and had been injured. So I went to meet him in the hotel. And of course, since I knew him well, and he was the father of my friend, and then who should turn up but Bongo Bandhu himself? And while somehow it was probably the Chhatro League people who had actually attacked him, Bongo Bandhu had come to convey his sympathies to him, paying no cognizance to the source of his problem, but saying that, Mia Sahab, how is it possible that anyone would dare to attack you when you are coming to Bangladesh, when you are coming to Dhaka? And how are you in those days? Political relationships between contested political parties was very civilized, and Bongo Bandhu was a good example of that civilized relationship. But then when he saw that a few nights ago he had met me at the residence of a Muslim leaguer, and here was I now visiting Mia Iftikharuddin on the other side of the political spectrum, he was then naturally both impressed and amused and saying, "Tumi ekhane ki korcho?" In that sense. And so that was part of a relationship. But then the relationship developed when he began reading my writings on two economies and disparity and so forth, and that was a later part of the story.
Yeah, I was going to come to that. So, so you arrived in Dhaka in January '57 or so, and then joined the Dhaka University. But a few months before that, something important happened in Dhaka University. This was a meeting arranged by the Pakistan Economic Association to discuss the draft of the first 5-year plan. So Pakistan took a while to have their first 5-year plan. And there, a group of Bangladeshi economists, of which Professor Nurul Islam was one, Professor Emin Huda, Dr. Habibur Rahman, and several others. And that's where the idea of two economies was first articulated, if I'm not wrong. Maybe people had talked about it. And this was not just in terms of disparity. This was actually the application of an economic concept of factor immobility, that because of the geographic separation of the two provinces, the trickle-down argument of the Pakistani establishment was not going to work, because factors would not be able to move as freely between the two provinces. Because the argument that the Pakistani establishment was using to support their disproportionate allocation of resources to West Pakistan was that West Pakistan had a much better capacity to absorb the resources, and therefore the pie would be much larger, and quite a bit of that would trickle down to East Pakistan. So East Pakistanis would be better off, actually, with this disproportionate resource allocation than if more resources were given to East Pakistan. And this was a formal refutation of that argument. So that had happened a few months before you came. You were not part of that, but you played a major role in taking those concepts, in addition to your own research, and taking it beyond the world of academia through your writings, which eventually took the messages to the politicians. And I think that's a very, very important task, and I would like to know a bit more about how that was done. But if you can also tell us whether you feel that that kind of linkages have become rather weak now.
Well, I think the core issue of that is, which in a way put me slightly apart from my colleagues, is that they were perhaps more senior and more serious academics. And they were addressing this academically, even though everyone knew the political implications of this. But I was the one who began writing in newspapers. So when you write in newspapers, you tend to get better known. And what was very interesting was that when we began writing, Pakistan was then under martial law. Ayub Khan had declared martial law in October of 1958. And so one of the consequences of the Ayub martial law was that politicians were embargoed from speaking in public. Quite a number of them were also in jail, like Bangabandhu. But even when they were released from jail, they were embargoed from speaking in public. So the main voice of the problems of the then East Pakistan and the issue of nationalism was being articulated by academics, at least those academics who were willing to speak in public. Now, not all academics, even if they had strong views, were willing to actually speak out in public. I mean, Professor Nurul Islam was a much better academic and had done more research on that, but he was an academic. So when I made speeches on this subject, these tended to get a lot of attention in the papers. In fact, my address at Lahore, at a big conference over there, was reproduced in the Pakistan Observer for 2 successive days at that time with headlines. Now, no one really knew that I was then only 26 years old and just a senior lecturer at Dhaka University. So politicians thought that here was some senior economist. The Pakistanis thought that I was some mature person, and they began taking my writings much more seriously. So this was the way in which it worked out, and this is the way in which we were drawn to the attention of Bangabandhu. He then invited me and Kamal Hussain at that time, when they were preparing the manifesto of the Awami League for the 1964 elections, to come along and help him in preparing the manifesto. That's when we came into direct political contact. But we used to meet Bangabandhu also when Mr. Sohrawardi used to come to town, because Kamal's father was Mr. Sohrawardi's physician. So whenever he came to Dhaka, he would then come to Kamal's house in Bailey Road, and Bangabandhu would then be there, and again we met. So this was one part of the relationship. But the important follow-up question that you asked was that Bangabandhu and Tajuddin and people like him, and not just him, but other politicians, were very conscious of the fact that in particular areas they needed to be better informed. And they were then quite willing to reach out to academics to help them in enhancing their understanding of problems. Professor Razak was greatly admired by most of the politicians of East Pakistan, and they sought him out, took him along to meetings of the Basic Principles Committee when that was being debated on formulating the Pakistan Constitution. And Bangabandhu and others reached out to us. I remember members of the then parliament used to come and visit me in Kamal, and they would want us to brief them before they went to attend the National Assembly session, and we would give them prepared questions and even sort of table cut motions and things which they could put forward. So there was a clearly expressed demand for trying to understand problems and to seek out people who could help them. Not everyone was willing to come forward. We were, so there was a match of supply and demand. Today, I think there is both a demand and a supply deficiency. I mean, suppliers are willing to write and to speak in seminars, but the effective demand for their services, I find, is much weaker for some reason. So either you are operating from the government side in the notion that they are sufficiently well informed by their own bureaucrats and their own advisors. As far as the opposition politicians are concerned, I find there is a hesitation to come forward, and also from my profession, some inhibitions about being identified by advising opposition politicians. So there is again a supply side failure and a demand side failure at this level.
But do you believe, like the famous Say's law, that sometimes supply can also create demand?
Well, all my life I have been operating with Say's law, that I have been hoping that my supply would create demand, and where it was not, I was willing to catch people by the neck and say, kindly consume my product. I mean, they did not always appreciate that, but that's the way I politically functioned as an academic economist. I was never an academic economist. I was always catering to influence political opinion. But this determination to actually persuade people to embrace your political ideas and to directly engage with them and influence them. We try to do a bit of that at CPD today, but much really depends on the strength of the demand side.
I mean, I remember Professor Nurul Islam, with whom I've had many conversations till his passing. He always used to say that unless the policymakers, we are talking about policymakers, it will apply to politicians in general, have a felt need, they are not going to come and ask for advice. And if you try to give advice, that could be a waste of time. But when I did challenge him and said, but can you not also create demand? And that was the basis of this question as well, that sometimes it may be possible. If you are proactive, you go on prodding them, maybe some demand will be created. And that's what you have tried throughout your life.
The whole premise of the Center for Policy Dialogue is policy advocacy. That we've attempted to create and build an institution where we are advocating policies and we try to bring politicians to participate in our dialogues. But as I said, it is very much a supply-driven process. My own hope, expectation when I set up CPD was that over the period of time, there would be stronger effective demand coming from the other side. I get the impression that that has not quite worked that way, and that if anything, effective demand has become weaker from all sides of the political spectrum. They are more engaged in the actual political struggle itself rather than to enhance their policy consciousness. So we keep on pressing with the supply side, but as I said, as with economics, so in politics, you need demand.
And there's another comment you make somewhere where you say that the way a government would respond to critical comments, often the response is negative, but the strength of the negativity doesn't necessarily depend on the strength of the critique, but the degree of insecurity the authorities feel. In other words, if it's a secure authority, you may have a very stringent critique, and yet you may be received reasonably well, right?
That's very true, because I've often asked myself that the sort of things we said, and said it up front and in your face, as they say, in the course of the 1960s, how was this accepted in a martial law regime and a regime which was backed by the cantonment? And my conclusion is that the Ayub regime, from its martial law virtually to its last days, was very confident and secure in their sense of power. And their view always was that, well, let these Bengali economists at Dhaka University say whatever they like. We can live with that. And in fact, very interestingly, when we went to Pindi or Islamabad to participate in seminars which they called on the plan or the budget, senior ministers and bureaucrats would actually come and sit with us and argue with us and debate with us. And they knew what I was writing. I'm told that they had even set up a small cell in the Planning Commission of Pakistan to read my writings so that they could then effectively refute me. They could do that because they were confident that no one was going to dislodge them from power. In subsequent years, in the Bangladesh era, I found a progressive depreciation in that sense of self-confidence on the part of the powers that be. And the more insecure they feel, the more sensitive they become to whatever criticism is actually taking place. So that on quite trivial issues now, you see ministers sort of getting angry or getting provoked. And I noticed that the media loves to provoke the ministers by going and saying that XYZ said this yesterday because they have just seen the headline, and the minister, or even beyond that, react to the headline. No one has actually read what we've said and attempted to have a serious debate with us, but they remain sensitive to the headline and they would then react to that. So what has completely disappeared now from the political landscape is to have a serious political debate on particular issues that we are putting on the table, saying you agree, you disagree, you put forward your reasons. But that hardly happens now. And from the time that I started CPD to the present, the curve has been downward sloping in terms of their responsiveness to engage in serious political debate.
Now, of course, the confidence of the Pakistani establishment was perhaps misplaced because the regime did crumble quite fast in the late 60s. But anyway, it's perceived security which decides how authorities behave. Now, at one place in your book, and this is where I'm going to quote, you talk about the radicalized mood in the late 1960s. And in that context, you write, the reality of 1969 East Pakistan demanded that Bangabandhu must reach out to a broader national constituency where the great majority of households were working people. It was this large constituency of the deprived who could invest him with a massive mandate. He needed to politically challenge the military and would stand by him if this confrontation could not be resolved through the democratic route. And you say also that although some people believe that Bangabandhu partly represented the rising bourgeois class of Bengalis, and he probably quickly realized that he couldn't rely too much on them, especially if there was going to be a crackdown. So when he came out of prison in 1969, the mood was different, but he was quick to grasp that, right? He was able to grasp that the mood of the country has become much more radicalized compared to 1966 when he went into jail. And how did it affect his strategy, his platform, his philosophy?
Well, in a way, the mood had begun changing with the publication of 6 Points. And the big public meetings which were held, particularly in Dhaka, had brought out a much wider working class constituency rather than the sort of student and middle class constituency which came on the streets. But the turning point was the 69 movement, where the students were really joined by the workers and the trade unions in their challenge to the then Ayub regime. And I think people like Sirajul Alam Khan and others who had built up relationships with the trade unions and these left Chhatro union people who had integrated with the unions played a very effective role in bringing workers out onto the streets. And that period of Ghirao and Jalao and so on and so forth, which had become part of the political landscape, became a very effective mobilizing force. Now, Bangabandhu sensed that there was a new force on the streets when he came out of jail. But I think for him, what really changed the consciousness of his thinking was when he began the election campaign for the elections at the end of, what would it be, at the beginning of 1970, at that time. And when he went out into the countryside, he then saw that vast mass of people were really coming out in response to whatever issues he was putting forward at that time. I remember, as I've written over here, when I went with him on some of his campaigns, one of them when we were going to the constituency of Tajuddin and Ahmadul Kabir in Kaliganj, where they were meeting. When we drove first through to Adamji Nagar in Demra, 100,000 workers had come out over there to greet him. And then when we were going down the river to Kaliganj, all the way from Demra to Kaliganj, there was along the banks uh, men, women, children of all ages there to greet him. And this was what he was seeing wherever he went. So he noticed now that this was really the constituency which was going to be his voters and which were going to give him the overwhelming majority he needed. So, whilst the Awami League was really a multi-class party, it had a strong commitment to building up a Bengali bourgeoisie at that particular time, and certainly the Bengali bourgeoisie identified with him. Right up to the elections, the left of East Pakistan, all the various factions, always thought of Bangabandhu as the leader of the Bengali bourgeoisie. And what we were writing in Forum is that this is a very serious mistake. He is no longer that. He now has a mass constituency, most of whom constitute the working class. And so when we began to frame the party manifesto for the 1970 elections, he was very conscious of this constituency. And we were very sensitive then to what we had observed. So this 1970 manifesto of the Awami League was a very radical manifesto, more radical perhaps than the manifestos of the left-wing political parties at that time. And he had the full support of that, even though there was a big segment in his party of businessmen. So I remember when the manifesto was approved and it was presented to the meeting of the Awami League Council, I think it would have been sometime in about July of 1970. Nurul Islam was in Dhaka at that time. We went to the council meeting and we presumed there will be a very big debate on this because M.R. Siddiqui and a whole bunch of other businessmen of some consequence who were expecting the Awami League to create a big opportunity for building up the business class over there, were all going to oppose this. But when he presented the manifesto to the council meeting, he said, "This is the manifesto." Then we were getting ready for the debate. He then held it up and he said, "Do you people all approve?" Approve? They all approved. And so that was the end of, that was in a way the political radicalization of the Awami League through its manifesto. So what happened in post-71 was not very radical. It was really a realization of a manifesto which had already been approved by the party, which reflected the changed consciousness in the thinking of Bangabandhu and Tajuddin, who was more radical.
In fact, both you and Professor Islam were a little uneasy that there wasn't much debate. And later on you realized the absence of debate meant that it was difficult to implement the agenda post-72 because the debate would have generated in some way or the other some ownership and understanding of the issues.
I agree that we were very concerned that we wanted this issue to be debated and whatever differences were there should actually come out and be resolved at the party level. But there's not a very strong tradition of debates in council meetings of political parties, as we discovered then, and the tradition has perpetuated over the years. So you are mostly endorsing what the leadership actually wants, rather than reflecting a democratic consensus within the party. I mean, had that been there, the course of our politics might have been very different.
And the manifesto, in a way, was if I'm not mistaken, a blending of the 6 points and also the 11 points.
That is correct.
Because the 6 points only said that East Pakistan or the provinces in general should have autonomy to decide their policies, but not much on what the policies could be like, whether it be a market economy, a socialist economy, or whatnot. But there was more of that in the 11 points. And it was the blending of the 6 points and 11 points which underpinned the manifesto in a sense.
Well, that was the broad directive that we got when we were preparing that. But of course, then we went into greater details than in the 11 points and then tried to relate it to the fact that we were also conscious of, by then he was preparing a manifesto for all Pakistan. So there was a strong element of the abolition of having major land reforms in West Pakistan, and then within East Pakistan, we envisage both land reforms, cooperatives as political institutions, and of course, we had the nationalization agenda built into it. But I know you have a further question on that, and I will come to that. I won't speak of it just now.
Yeah, but just one point which I didn't share that question with you before, but often there's still a school of thought in Bangladesh that perhaps Bangabandhu did not want independence till sometime in March. Now I remember that Professor Islam said something, and you may agree, that when you had that what we nowadays call a retreat, where Bangabandhu invited you, a group of you, Dr. Kamal Hossain was there, you, Professor Islam, and a few others. And I think it was somewhere in Narayanganj where you met for the whole day. And what Bangabandhu wanted was to go through the detailed implications of the 6 points, because he was going to present a constitution, a draft constitution, and he was prepared for tough questioning from the opponents. So he wanted to work out all the details. And apparently when you and Professor Islam and Dr. Kamal Hossain teased out the details and pointed out that if you stick to all the 6 points without compromising, this will have to be an independent Bangladesh.
No, that is not.
That's not. Well, Professor Islam somehow used to believe that if you have a different view, that will be interesting.
No, Professor Islam, I suspect, also suffers from retrospective thought, or at least he did at that particular time. Basically, what Bangabandhu wanted to know after the elections was that is the 6 points implementable in the context of a united Pakistan? Can it be made to work? And we had detailed sittings every day from about 9:30 in the morning till 9:30 in the evening, sitting on the banks of the Budi Ganga at that time, debating these issues. And what we, the academics, and particularly the economists, Anisur Rehman, Nurul Islam, and myself, told him is that if the Pakistanis are sincere about building a democratic constitution which accommodates the needs of East Pakistan, it can be made to work, even though it is a very extreme form of documentation. Obviously, if they don't want to make it work, then even a more moderate constitution would not effectively work. What we wanted to establish was that the 6 points were implementable. Now, what I had written in my memoir is that from the time that 6 points was presented, right up to the last days in March of 1971, no major Pakistani political figure, whether it was Yahya Bhutto or anyone else, actually sat down with Bangabandhu or even with people like us to actually have a detailed discussion about what were their agreements and disagreements on the 6 points and why this could not be made to work. So much of my writings in forum were trying to explain to the Pakistanis that tell us what your problems are. And I was sent by Bangabandhu to West Pakistan in January of 1971 after the elections to go and talk to the People's Party people and their high command, and to then discuss with them and to say that what are your problems with this? And what I found when I went there and met with all their leaders is that none of them had any serious thinking on the subject. None of them had prepared any constitutional draft. None of them were willing to sit down and debate with me. And when Bhutto came to Dhaka with his entourage at the end of January, he was also not at that time interested in talking about 6 points. He wanted to know about power sharing in the center. So, irony is that for all that time, right up to the end, I have never participated, and neither has Bangabandhu, on a serious debate on the pros and cons of 6 points. Pakistan eventually broke on that, but they broke on other issues, and the 6 points were really left as they were. That was the interesting point that we made. Now, Nurul Islam's notion post facto was that, well, it was really a blueprint for secession. Well, in theory, if you are not going to make it work, it would have been a secessionist document. But he and I were engaged in persuading Bangabandhu that it is a workable document, and that's what he did.
Well, of course, the debate didn't happen then, but Bangabandhu was expecting that after the elections, they will all
That's
sit
right.
in the parliament and they will have this debate. Now, on this thing about them not being prepared, the other side, I think you quote the British wife of your school friend, Rafi Raza, who was privy to some of your discussions with him, and apparently she commented that the Bengalis seem very, very well prepared, and you guys, by comparison, are like amateurs.
They said that the Bengalis are professionals. They have done their homework. You guys have done nothing. You just talked. So that is the difference between the two of you.
So now coming to March, we all celebrate the 26th of March as our Independence Day. But you say in this book that Bangladesh really became independent sometime in the first week of March. And therefore, a lot of what people like you and Professor Islam and Dr. Kamal Hossain were doing was actually advising Bangabandhu on how to run an independent administration in those few weeks.
Well, what I think the crucial statement which I quote, and I got that statement from the GOC of Pakistan at that time, Khadim Hussain Raja, is the resignation letter of General Yaqub, in which he writes that actually the authority in East Pakistan has now passed to Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and that applying martial law and resorting to force to enforce the law would be politically meaningless and would lead to unnecessary loss of lives. So he had, at that time, become very clear because they had gone for enforcing martial law immediately after the decision of Yahya to postpone the assembly meeting. And when resistance took place, firing took place, but eventually the support for Bangabandhu and his position was so strong that he concluded that the whole situation had changed completely. And so not only did he take that decision in his letter, he withdrew the troops from the streets and put them back into the cantonment. And the point I make is that the withdrawal of the Pakistani troops into the cantonment would be the effective date that I would say that East Pakistan became Bangladesh. That was the crucial moment. And the crucial factor on that was that at that time, Pakistani authority ceased to function in what was then East Pakistan. Now, when it ceased to function, we were still part of a non-cooperation movement. But a non-cooperation movement where the army had withdrawn into the cantonment and everyone was on strike meant that the whole system of both economic management and law and order was breaking down completely. And so, for the first time in any history of any liberation struggle anywhere in the world, at least to my knowledge, you had a situation where management and administration of the economy in the country passed into the hands of a opposition leader. And that is what happened. That businessmen were wanting to know, well, can we open our factories? How are we going to pay salaries? Can the tube wells be made to operate? How is kerosene going to be delivered to the farmers? These were all working decisions which were affecting the lives of the whole population. So an effective administration was set up. And we were looking at the economic issues. Kamal Hussain and Tajuddin were looking at this. The bureaucrats then had all pledged their loyalty to Bangabandhu. The police had pledged their loyalty to Bangabandhu. They were coming led by Mr. Sanaul Haq, who was then the senior CSP officer, to Kamal Hussein's house in 3 Circuit House Row for instructions about what administrative orders had to be then implemented. businessmen were being given instructions about how they should deal with their factories, whether they should disburse salaries or not. So effectively, administration began functioning with the apex at Road 32 in Bangabandhu's residence, and Kamal Hussein's house as a secretariat, and Nurul Islam's house as the sort of economic policy advisory body over there. So that was essentially the unique feature of the period of March 1971, where an effective administration had gone into operation. Now, as I said, I've looked at the history books and I've known and read of many successful non-cooperation movements of resistance, but I've never come across any recorded history where the entire machinery of government had pledged its loyalty to an opposition leader, and he effectively began running that particular area or that particular country. So that's why I say that if you're having all these foolish debates about when independence was declared or not, but as far as I'm aware, the country was independent and remained so, so that when the Pakistanis attacked us, everyone resisted. For them, it was Pakistan committing aggression against the sovereign state of an independent Bangladesh.
So then there's the crackdown, and you go to India, and there's a very interesting, and to me it was a little intriguing, that when you tried, and Mr. Tajuddin Ahmed had also crossed the border, and he wanted an appointment with Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, and you had friends in her office, Mr. P.N. Haksar and others were known to you, and you were trying to arrange the meeting, and you were surprised to learn that most of them didn't have much of an idea about this number two person, Mr. Tajuddin Ahmed. And I found that a bit surprising. I mean, these things are going on next door, and all they know about is Bangabandhu. Why not about the other leaders?
Well, Pakistanis always used to argue in a lot of the literature which has been written in Pakistan that there was a great conspiracy leading up to the independence of Bangladesh between India and the Awami League and Bangabandhu. I was absolutely amazed at how ignorant the Indian leadership was about the details and small print of what was actually going on in the then Bangladesh. I was quite amazed. I mean, they knew about Bangabandhu, they had the broad details, they knew that here was this unchallenged leader. But how the whole liberation process began, what were the factors leading up to the military crackdown, what were the capacity of the resistance at that time, who were the people who were then in a position to then effectively continue the governance of what was then an independent Bangladesh. All this they had only a very vague idea. And I got this after having a 2 or 3 hour conversation with Mr. P.N. Haksar, who was then the principal secretary to Indira Gandhi, but who was effectively known in India as the second most powerful person in the country after Indira Gandhi. That he was a hugely intelligent and well-informed person. But on these issues, they were very unclear. And their main apprehension was that now that Bangabandhu had been arrested and had been taken off to West Pakistan, who then was going to lead the liberation struggle? And what were the forces arrayed? Were the Bengalis committed to full independence? What was the resistance capacity? All these were gray areas for them. And later, when I was then meeting with all the top journalists of the country, all the famous names, Kuldeep Nair and others, they only had a very vague idea about what was happening. So I've always been surprised then, and strangely enough, still surprised in 2024, as to how little our neighbors know about the details of what is going on, whether in our economy or in our politics.
And even in 71, they had a deputy high commission, presumably well staffed, with people who knew Bengali, and yet there was this ignorance.
They had the general idea, but not the full details at all.
I'd like to open up the floor, but of course, you had a major role in those 9 months as an ambassador for Bangladesh, canvassing all over the world, while at the same time maintaining regular contact with the government in Kolkata. So we'd like to hear a little bit about that. I mean, we could probably spend a whole hour talking about it, but just a little bit,
Well,
and then
I'll
we'll
be
open
very
up.
brief on that. You see, after I went over, we were there from the beginning of April, which is just the time that Tajuddin and Barrister Amirul Islam got there. And so when I connected with Mr. Tajuddin, and we were then discussing what's to be done. We had heard that the Pakistanis were sending over Mr. M.M. Ahmed, who was then the chief, you may say, the super czar, economic czar, to go and ask the US and the World Bank for more aid to Pakistan because they were facing serious difficulty. So Tajuddin was furious that here were the Pakistanis massacring us, and then they were going to the Americans and the World Bank and wanting aid to finance that process. So he said, you must immediately set out to Washington to then frustrate this campaign of M.M. Ahmad's and to tell them about the real facts of what is happening over here. So at that time, he had not constituted a government, but he just sent me off as his envoy. And so when I arrived in first in London and then in Washington, the main target was to go to the U.S. government and to go to the World Bank and to tell them the facts of life and to say that you will be financing genocide if you actually do that. So that was really the main nature of my campaign. And when I landed in Washington, at that time, all the Pakistan embassy people were still in the Pakistan embassy. Mohit and Kibriya and Inayatul Kareem, they had not defected at that time. So leading that part of the campaign it became in a way my responsibility, since I was the only person at that time who had come with any sort of authority from someone from the liberation struggle. And I was then given the responsibility of hearing on television, going to the US Congress, because we found that the US government at that time was totally set against doing anything for the Bengalis and were largely sympathizing for historic reasons, as you know. And so our main target was the US Congress, and I was then invited to address senators and to go to the US National Press Club in Washington and to speak to the media. And those were the responsibilities I discharged until a much bigger and more sort of stronger capacity from the diplomats, Bengali diplomats, after they defected in the beginning of August. That's how the process began. But our main campaign there was to stop aid to Pakistan. And effectively, we did succeed because throughout that campaign, both in IU went to Paris to lobby the Pakistan Aid Consortium. They never pledged any new aid to Pakistan. So the only aid which Pakistan was getting at that period was whatever was left in the pipeline and what the US government was secretly in a position to smuggle through to them, including through some arms shipments.
Okay, so well, thank you very much for this fascinating journey from your childhood to 1971. Let's open up the floor for about 20 minutes. Questions, comments. If comments, then please try to keep them brief, and please do introduce yourself. Mrs. Hamida Hussain first.
I'm Hamida Hussain, and thank you, Rehman. Now it means that I don't need to read the books, I've heard it all. But I want to ask you that you're a member of the first Planning Commission, and in all your writings before Bangladesh became independent, you've talked about taking a very radical line. So as a member of the Planning Commission, how difficult was it for the four of you or five of you to work together? Other member, Anis Rehman, one and So how did it work out?
So we'll keep your question there.
Yeah, we'll
Okay.
remember your question.
Sir, thank you, sir. Really very wonderful discussion. Thank you, Dr. Akhtar. Mustafizur Rahman from Center for Policy Dialogue. So I was wondering, I just wanted to know, amongst you teachers at Cambridge, who did inspire you the most?
Joan Robinson. She was part, in a way, what is known as a left-wing Keynesian. That would be the description. But she was my supervisor for my last year. I used to go and have one-on-one. I used to have two supervisors, the one assigned to me and one I chose, which was Joan Robinson. And she had this broader view, but a big critic of Joan Robinson is Amartya Sen. I don't know if you've read his memoirs. She has strong disagreements with her because he accuses Joan Robinson of favoring the prioritization of economic growth and giving less emphasis to human development at that time. So he claims that he had disagreements with her on that subject.
Sir, my name is Ronnie. I have two embarrassing questions, rather, I would say. First, as a Nehruvian socialist thinker or a socialist orientation, do you have any chance to interact with common people to know from the roots and that what actually their problem is, rather than detecting problems from data or reports or from your students? Do you have any first-hand experience with common people? That is the first question. And my second question is, recently I have been reading David Hume's autobiography, the 27-page long autobiography. The first sentence was that there can be no autography of telling oneself without vanity. So do you think that in your 2 volumes of memoir, do you feel that some of the description or the analysis you have posed on about your life, do you have that feel that you have said something more that didn't actually happen?
Well, on the first question, obviously much less than I should have in terms of identifying with the common people at that time when I was a university teacher and developing my views. And obviously when I developed my views in Cambridge, I had no connections whatsoever. It was not that we did not have any point of contact, but it was much less than in fact would be appropriate given the sort of views we had. On the second question, anyone who writes an autobiography or a memoir obviously must suffer from a great deal of vanity. I mean, otherwise, why would you assume that anyone else would be interested enough to want to read about what you have to say about your life? So every autobiography is an exercise in vanity, as far as I'm concerned. What was the follow-up on that?
No, I think that. Well, he obviously meant more vanity than that,
Ah.
than the mere act of writing.
Yeah.
Whether you were exaggerating things.
Oh, but as far as you were exaggerating things, well, it's difficult to say. I suppose other people will have to decide from an objective analysis as to whether one was exaggerating anything or not. When you write it, you don't think you are by definition exaggerating anything, though many people actually very consciously set out to exaggerate their role in various events. I like to think that I did what I did, but obviously, since this is an exercise in vanity and a memoir is a highly subjective document, other people will have to objectively observe as to whether I have said more than I should have. I don't think I have, but anyway, I'm not the judge of that.
Okay, I'm Rubaiyat Sarar, Managing Director at Innovation Consulting. What an auspicious occasion to hear you both. So, as a practitioner in international development, I have to deal a lot with bureaucrats, government, private sector, and we have to convince them. And I was very intrigued when you talked about the culture of listening, the supply and demand issue, whether the politicians are listening to practitioners, and it was really great to hear how in those times they listened to you and brought you on board and really feel the struggle that they don't bring us along. So I'm just wondering whether you have a piece of an advice for people like us who are working in the field. How can we make that change happen? How can we bring that culture back where we are brought in the policy discussion? Do you have a piece of an advice for us?
Also take Akash Bhai's question. Let's take two
Okay,
questions. And then,
all right.
yeah, please.
I can speak. Thank you, sir. I was wondering, you are a person who have direct conversation and interaction with both Tajuddin and Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Later on, they got separated from each other. And in the earlier phase, the years of fulfillment, during that period, they were united. I think you are the right person who can explain why they got separated.
No. Well, on the first question, I'm not sure that I have any very clear advice on the subject. Obviously, you always felt that political leaders or policymakers should get their advice from as diverse a source of information as possible. In fact, my experience in Bangladesh is that the best advisors to any government would be its critics, because the very nature of the advice which you get from within the government is to reinforce all your prejudices and mistakes. And so, if not only is it uninformative, it is also in many cases misleading. Provided that you have constructive and serious critics, if you look at what they say, you will learn a lot, and it will also help you to improve policy. The problem of treating your critics or people who disagree with you as your enemies is, I think, one of the biggest tragedies which we face in Bangladesh for a long period of time. That is one issue. The Akash issue is in a way being
we can
addressed.
cover it.
But the prequel to that is that it was really an inspiring sight to see the real closeness of the relationship between Bangabandhu and Tajuddin. And the chemistry of that relationship was really a very crucial element in the direction of the liberation struggle. Because Bangabandhu performed the role of motivator, mobilizer, the charismatic leader. Tajuddin was the person who was then always there, pointing out to him what were the problems, where he may be getting it wrong, how this could be improved. He was his most intimate and inspiring, not just friend, but critic. And this combination was, I think, of unique significance to our liberation. Had Tajuddin not been there, in a way, it would have been much more problematic for Bangabandhu to take this forward. And I think he really appreciated the presence of Tajuddin in virtually every important decision that he took and all the major actions he took, Tajuddin was by his side and he sought him out. And if there were issues which were presented to him, he would tell a person that go and talk to Tajuddin.
I know there are one or two more hands, but I also realized that we took longer than the original plan, 40 minutes. So can I get some guidance from Mahrukh on how long can we continue this? I think it's about 5:15 or so now.
We actually have a question in Zoom. So if I may
No, I
ask
just
the
want
question.
to get some idea of how much longer we can continue the session.
Do you want to have the questions but then move on to the next
Yeah, no, sure, I'll do that, but just to get some sense of the timing that.
We're okay with.
You are, okay, all right,
hour.
okay, okay.
As long as, you know,
All right, okay,
I'm
fine.
okay.
So let's take the Zoom question first, and then I'll come to you. No, let's take the Zoom question first.
We have Rashida K. Chaudhuri connected with us over Zoom, and she wants to ask us a question. So please, Ms. Rashida K. Chaudhuri. Thank you.
Thank you, because I'm so sorry I couldn't make it to come over there. So thanks to Sir and to Akhtar Bhai for this wonderful, what should I say, enlightening session and discussion. What I would like to know from Sir, when Sir started his work, I don't even call it career because it goes beyond career, much more than a career. So when he started, we used to follow him like a role model as young people. My question is whether these days our young population will be interested to know about what was done by these people like Sar and others, whether they will be ready to follow, because we sometimes get frustrated. So that's the question, sir. Whether you are still, ready to provide us the role model that you used to be. Thank you.
Bhavishya?
Yes, going forward from now on.
I see. Well, all I can do is stay alive.
Actually, my fondest hope is that we can meet again in 10 years' time as you celebrate your centenary and have a
Inshallah.
conversation like this. And by which time your third volume will be published, of course, much sooner than that, and maybe many more writings. Let's take one more question from there.
Pardon me if there is any limitation in my delivery of my language.
Bangla bolen.
Okay. বাংলায় বলে আচ্ছা ঠিক ওকে অসুবিধা নেই আমি যেটা জানতে চাচ্ছিলাম স্যারের একটা খুব চমৎকার আলোচনা হচ্ছে সেখান থেকে আমার যে কৌতূহলটা আর কি সেটা হলো যে আপনি বলছিলেন যে 71 সালে যখন দিল্লিতে আপনারা ছিলেন তখন ওখানকার যে ইন্ডিয়ান সরকারি কর্মকর্তাদের যাদের সাথে আপনার আলাপ হচ্ছিল তো আপনি একটু অবাক হয়ে লক্ষ্য করলেন যে তারা বাংলাদেশের স্বাধীনতা আন্দোলন বা তখনকার যে স্বাধিকার আন্দোলন বা স্বায়ত্তশাসন আন্দোলন সেই আন্দোলনের নেতৃত্ব সম্পর্কে বা তার স্ট্রেংথ সম্পর্কে তাদের খুব ভালো ধারণা বোধহয় ছিল না তারা মানে শেখ মুজিবুর রহমানকে জানতেন এবং তার বাইরে বাকিদের সম্পর্কে তাদের ধারণা ছিল না তো এই ব্যাপারের সাথে আমি যে কথাটা জিজ্ঞেস করতে চাচ্ছি সেটা হলো আমি কোথাও এক জায়গায় পড়েছি যে ইন্দিরা গান্ধীর সাথে যখন তাজউদ্দিন সাহেব প্রথম দেখা করেন বোধহয় মানে প্রথম গুরুত্বপূর্ণ প্রশ্নটা ছিল যে কি শেখ মুজিব কোথায় তিনি কেন মানে কি বলে যে গ্রেফতারটাকে এক ধরনের বরণ করলেন বা গ্রেফতার হলেন বা তিনি কেন এই ধরনের একটা প্রশ্ন বোধহয় ছিল যদি আমি ভুল না হয়ে থাকি তো আমি আপনার কাছে জানতে চাচ্ছি যে আপনার অভিজ্ঞতায় যে মানে তারা যেমন শেখ মুজিবের বাইরে অন্যদের সবাই জানতো না তেমনি শেখ মুজিবুর রহমান তিনি যে গ্রেফতার হয়ে গেলেন এটা নিয়ে কি তাদের মানে তাদের প্রতিক্রিয়াটা কী ছিল বা তাদের কি কোনো ধরনের এটা নিয়ে কোনো ধরনের সাসপিশন তাদের ভিতর ছিল কিনা যে উনি কি নিজেই অ্যারেস্টেড হলেন কিনা বা এর ভিতর কোনো আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ডিং আছে কিনা বা সামথিং এর ভিতর অন্য কোনো বিষয় আছে কিনা এটা একটা বিতর্কিত বিষয় আমাকে ভুল বুঝবেন না আমি জাস্ট একটা কৌতূহল হিসেবে আপনার কাছে জানতে চাচ্ছি যেহেতু আপনি একজন ওয়াকিবহাল মানুষ ওই সময়কার বিষয় সম্পর্কে আরেকটা বিষয় আমার কৌতূহল যদি সম্ভব হয় যদি সংক্ষেপে একটু বলা যায় সেটা হলো যে আপনি যে 70 সালের ইলেকশন ম্যানিফেস্টো আপনারা যেভাবে ড্রাফট করেছিলেন এবং ওই সময়কার যে ক্রিয়া প্রতিক্রিয়া এগুলো বলছেন, তো ওখানে অনেক র্যাডিক্যাল কথাবার্তা ছিল আমরা সবাই জানি, যেটা আসলে আওয়ামী লীগের মতো একটা পার্টি দ্বারা অ্যাকসেপ্টেড হওয়ার কথা না, কিন্তু শেখ মুজিবুর রহমানের যে প্রভাবের কারণে বাকিরা কোনো বিতর্ক না তুলেই, কোনো প্রশ্ন না তুলেই সেটাকে একভাবে অ্যাকসেপ্ট করে নেন, যে কারণে পরবর্তী সেটা ইমপ্লিমেন্টেশন করা ক্ষেত্রে অনেক সমস্যা হয়, যেটা আপনি বলছিলেন। তো আমি জানতে চাচ্ছি, আমার কৌতূহল যে জায়গায়, যে শেখ মুজিবুর রহমান পার্সোনালি, আপনি যেহেতু তাকে চিনতেন, অন্তত একটা সাইড তাকে তার জানতেন, তিনি কি এটা মানে এই যে র্যাডিক্যাল প্রোগ্রামগুলো আপনাদের সাথে আলোচনার প্রেক্ষিতে ইলেকশন ম্যানিফেস্টোতে আসে, তিনি পার্সোনালি কতটুকু তার সাথে এইটাকে কতটুকু একাত্ম, এই ব্যাপারটা আপনি যে কীভাবে একটু দেখেন আর কি এটা?
না বুঝি। নাও দি ফার্স্ট পার্ট অফ দ্য কোয়েশ্চেন, এইটা আমার বিশেষ কিছু অ্যাড করা নাই, বাট আ নাম্বার অফ পিপল হ্যাভ রিটেন অ্যাবাউট দিস। ওই তাজউদ্দিন সাহেবের মেয়ে যে ওনার উপরে যে লেখা করেছে, ওইটার মধ্যে তো কিছু লেখা আছে। কামাল ওনার মেমোয়ারে কিছু লিখেছেন, কয়েকটা আরও লেখার মধ্যে এই আলোচনা হচ্ছে। তো আমার কোনো ভ্যালিউ অ্যাডেড এখানে নাই, বিকজ আই ডোন্ট হ্যাভ এনি ইনসাইড নলেজ। আমি ওনার সঙ্গে কখনো জিজ্ঞেস করি নাই কি হোয়াট ওয়াজ ইয়োর ideas at that particular time. Second প্রশ্ন যে আছে, that হ্যাঁ, ও সরি না, ওইটার উপরে as far as I know, if you read his memoirs, ওনার জেলের যে লেখা আছে, ওনার যে পলিটিক্যাল কনসিয়াসনেস ছিল ইন টার্মস অফ জনগণের সঙ্গে কীরকম একটা সম্পর্ক থাকবে, you will find that he is more radical than the manifesto and more radical even than my thinking. রৌনক ওনার ফিলসফির উপরে একটা খুব ভালো একটা ভাষণ দিয়েছে, আই থিঙ্ক ইট ওই সিলেটে না রৌনক? আচ্ছা, দেখ, হ্যাঁ, ওই প্রথম পাবলিশ করেছে ওনার, where his consciousness কি সাধারণ লোকের সঙ্গে, ওনার তো পুরো জীবন তো সাধারণ লোকের সঙ্গে উনি কেটেছেন। He writes of how he traveled by third class compartment in bus and nauka, and আজকাল তো সব তো এসইউভি থেকে যদি না পাওয়া যায় তো উনি তো যাই, they will not go anywhere. So that was the level at which he was meeting people at that time. And সমস্ত যে আন্দোলনের সঙ্গে উনি যুক্ত ছিলেন, they were related to concerns of working people. I mean, whether it was the fourth class employees of Dhaka University, whether it was the problem of farmers, he was very conscious of the nature of a highly exploitative society. কি শুধু আমার ইস্ট ওয়েস্টে এক্সপ্লয়টেশন নেই, আমার পুরো সমাজের মধ্যে এক্সপ্লয়টেশন আছে। So this was very central to his consciousness. So here was a person who was not reacting by reading books, উনি ওনার অভিজ্ঞতায় কেন্দ্র করে he was deriving his views and his consciousness. তো ওনার সঙ্গে যে আমার কথা হলো, and wherever we were there, whenever we were taking radical positions, এইটা ওনার মনে সবসময় ছিল। But he was a politician, and always he was then conscious of the problems he is going to face when you take actions A or B. তো কিছু আলোচনা তো যখন আখতারের সেকেন্ড ভলিউমের উপরে আলোচনা হবে, we will talk about that. But in my view, from whatever limited knowledge or understanding I had of him, I found him a person with a deep radical consciousness which derived from his experience with life and with the way in which he conducted his politics. Because ওনার তো ঘর বসা পলিটিক্স তো ছিল না, ওনার সব সময় উনি মাঠে ছিলেন, and ওই মাঠের সঙ্গে যে ওনার এক্সপোজার ছিল, this always infected his consciousness. That is why যখন ডিবেট হলো, he would be on my side rather than the other side.
Rehman bhai, being involved as you were in the liberation movement, আমার একটা জিনিস জানতে চাই, যখন বঙ্গবন্ধুকে সপরিবারে সরিয়ে দেয়া হলো, তারপরে আপনি অ্যাজ রেহমান সোবহান আপনার আপনি যেরকম ইনভলভ ছিলেন ইন দ্যাট ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড, আপনি বাংলাদেশের ভবিষ্যতের কথা ভেবে আপনার কি মনে হয়েছিল, বা আপনি যাদের সাথে শেয়ার করেছেন যে এখন বঙ্গবন্ধু চলে গেলেন, এই পর্ব শেষ হয়ে গেল, এখন দেশের কি হবে, এটা একটা। আর আজকে আপনি এই 2 ভলিউম মেমোয়ার লেখার পরে এই যে বসে আছেন এই বয়সে, বাংলাদেশের এখন যে অ্যাচিভমেন্ট বা চ্যালেঞ্জেস, এখন আপনার কি মনে হয় ওই চিন্তাটা বঙ্গবন্ধু চলে যাবার পরে যে চিন্তাটা ছিল তার সঙ্গে তুলনা করে এখন আপনার কি মনে হয় বাংলাদেশ সম্পর্কে?
এই প্রশ্নটা আবার খুব শেষে করি, দ্বিতীয় অংশের ইয়েটা শুনে তারপরে। Please hold your question because let's move to the second. So, 31st December 1971, you returned to Dhaka. In just about 12 days or so, you find yourself, along with Professor Nurul Islam, meeting Bangabandhu, and he immediately tells you what your TOR is going to be. So Professor Islam is going to be the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. You will be a member, along with Professor Anisur Rahman, and well, he probably didn't mention the names right there. And the major responsibility you and your colleagues were given was to implement the vision of a socialist economy for Bangladesh. And one of the first major acts of that government, which a lot of people ascribe to you, is the nationalizations of March 1972. You are called the father of nationalization. And that's not quite true, is it?
Well, it's very flattering to my sense of self-esteem to be thought of as the father of nationalization. I was then 37 years old. So that's a big compliment. Unfortunately, for me, anyway, that is not the way it happened. Actually, the real father of nationalization was the liberation of Bangladesh on 16th of December, 1971. On 16th of December, the entire bourgeoisie of what was then East Pakistan disappeared from the face of the earth, at least disappeared from the face of Bangladesh. None of you will have any real idea of the overall domination of the private sector economy by the O-Bengali bourgeoisie at all levels, not just major industries, banks, insurance companies, international trade, interwing trade, retail trade, but even at the middle level. When you go down Baitul Mukarram at the moment, virtually all the shops in Baitul Mukarram were then owned by O-Bengalis. So when this whole class disappears overnight, you have a huge vacuum which could only be filled by the state. What constituted the Bengali bourgeoisie at that time were a small handful of people who had been given ownership through massive loan and equity support by the government over some jute mills and some textile mills at that time. And they were in no position to take over Adamji jute mills or anything else because onar to nijer bepsha they had to manage. The only major Bengali businessman at that time was A.K. Khan. So therefore, the move forward into the major areas of the economy was created by a liberation struggle and not by a social revolution. ওইটা মূল বক্তব্য হলো। So that was the major idea, that you have got a political vacuum, a social and economic vacuum. This has to be filled by the state. So the ideological cover to that was given by the fact that the state is coming in through an instrument of nationalization and taking over the large industries. একটা definition ছিল, বাকিগুলি were supposed to be privatized. The only actual nationalization which took place were about the 5 or 10% capacity of the jute and textile mills which were in Bengali hands, 2 banks, and a few insurance companies, the majority of which had all been owned by the Obangalis. So this was the effective nationalization which actually took place. That was the objective reality. Now, everyone seems to think that the Awami League government nationalized everything. But even if they had nationalized everything, the only people who could take decisions of that nature was Bangabandhu himself. And Bangabandhu was a very politically conscious person. So the notion that he will listen to a 37-year-old university teacher who is going to tell him to nationalize this or that, and you say, ha, he is a very wise man, I must do it. It's insulting to Bangabandhu. That this was a very political decision. And he took that decision with full consciousness of the objective conditions, as he thought, which existed. And that was the decision which prevailed at that time. As I said, log jodi mone kore, so I will, as I said, when people flatter, you never disagree with them.
But you do say in the second volume that when you were discussing the scope of the nationalization program with Bangabandhu and Mr. Tajuddin, Bangabandhu was at least a little uneasy with the idea of taking over the Bengali-owned enterprises. And also, towards the end of your second volume, you acknowledge this unleashing of an entrepreneurial spirit in Bangladesh, which we have seen in the last 3 or 4 decades. And you do say that had we been able to predict this, maybe you'd have thought some things differently. And I would add my own view here. I have a feeling that Bangabandhu, with his intimate knowledge of Bengalis, the Bengali nature, may have been able to predict that there is a potential for Bengali entrepreneurship to blossom. And that could be the reason he was a little uneasy with the idea of taking over even the Bengali-owned enterprises.
Well, I find no evidence for that. Reason being as follows. If you are looking at the objective circumstances which prevailed on the 16th of December, there was really no history of a Bengali entrepreneurial class. So, Bhobishote ki holo was really at that time not on the horizon. ওই যে socio-political consciousness which existed in the minds of people like Bangabandhu and Tajuddin at that time was that, Bengali ব্যবসায়ী class hote pare, but they will only come about if we give them massive assistance in the way that the Pakistani bourgeoisie was built up. And they came with the background of business, because Memon, Aga Khani, Khoja, Shopto had all been historically business communities in India. Amar to Muslim Bengali there was no such class which existed over here. So we could create this class as Ayub was attempting to do, because Ayub Bishas chilo that this class will become the basis of my support if I'm going to go on ruling Pakistan. And the way I will then extend my political authority in East Pakistan is by building up a class of kulak, rich farmers through the basic democracies in the rural areas. And by giving massive public lending, I will build them up a bourgeois class over here. So, ওই সময়, the issue which Bangabandhu faced is that do I then carry the Ayub strategy forward in the post-liberation period? None of them had any equity. All of them were heavily leveraged in loan finance. Many of them also, their equity had been contributed by PIDC. So this meant that am I now willing in this resource-starved country in which huge obligations remain to the victims of the liberation war, to the social consciousness which exists over there, that I'm going to set about building up this business class of people. And he took the decision, whether from his experience or his value system or whether from his assessment of the objective realities of that time, that no, এটা সম্ভব নাই, কেমন লাগবে, that with these people who have actually suffered, who have actually lost their homes, their lives, I am now putting my resources into building up a bourgeoisie in the same way that the Pakistanis did. এটা তো হতে পারে না. And that was essentially the consciousness which prevailed at that time. So that is my reading. The notion that bhobishote ki hobe, that was not on the horizon. I mean, what was on the horizon is that amar ঋণ দিয়ে, support দিয়ে, subsidy দিয়ে আমি একটা class শিশদি করতে পারবো এখানে. That was on the horizon. Now, what came about later was a process which developed in the late 80s. After all, Zia or Rehman went down that road, that I will build up a class by giving them loan from the, as you well know, from the public financial institutions, and that is what he did. That was a route which Bangabandhu was not willing to take. That would be my reading.
And that, of course, was my first major piece of research, which I worked with you on, which is the attempt to build entrepreneurs through different types of privileges, which started under Zia Rahman's regime. But anyway, just to complete and you need not respond, I mean, nonetheless, in Bangabandhu's government, in Bangabandhu's policy, space was left for private entrepreneurs.
No, sure.
And the investment limit was actually significantly raised during his tenure in 1974.
That's right.
So the scope for Bengali entrepreneurs to emerge in a different type of policy support regime, that was there.
That
So
was
it's not
there,
that
I
was-
agree.
that
He
was-
wanted to encourage medium and small business at that time, and he was fully supportive of that.
So, coming back to the Planning Commission experience, now here we have a set of outsiders. You, Professor Islam, Professor Rahman, and Professor Musharraf Hussain were all outsiders to the system. And here I remember an anecdote, let me share that with you. You know, we have this institution, used to be called the Board of Investment, which always is headed by a civil servant. And there are many of us in the World Bank, and myself included, who used to believe that this position should go to somebody from the business sector, because it's after all about private investment. And there was a time about 20 years ago when someone from the private sector was appointed as the executive chairman of BOI. And at that time, Dr. Akbar Ali Khan was the alternate executive director in the bank. And one day when I took the metro returning home from DC, I entered the carriage and there is Dr. Khan sitting in the front. And I shared my enthusiasm at a business person being appointed head of BOI. And he said, and I'll just say that in Bangla, ছেলেটা ভালো কিন্তু আমরা তো তাকে কাজ করতে দেব না. By Amra, he means the bureaucrats.
Yeah.
We bureaucrats are not going to let this outsider work. It was your experience as well?
I wouldn't know. I would say that the response from the bureaucrats was mixed. And some were willing to work with us, some less so. But they would not do it up front. They would do it through their ministers. Because at that time, the idea of elected ministers being in charge was very strongly built into the political consciousness of that period. That unlike the Pakistani period, where the bureaucrats were kings and the ministers were their sort of deputies, here the new ministers coming at the end of a liberation struggle felt that they were the authority. So if they wanted to contest us, they would prefer to do it through the ministers themselves.
And you have written somewhere that after having studied political economy for a long time, you are now confronted with the realities of dealing with political economy. And you knew that you needed support in navigating the maze of politics. And the expectation from the commission was that Mr. Tajuddin Ahmed, who was actually as planning minister also chairman of the commission for quite some time, would play that role. And reading your book, the second volume, one gets the impression that you were a bit disappointed with the amount of support you gave. That's my reading. I don't know if it's that
Well,
correct.
it was not so much disappointed as surprised, because essentially we always believed that Mr. Tajuddin was the most radical of the ministers, and he actually was. I mean, in terms of our interaction with him pre-liberation, in the preparation of the manifesto, in the support he gave to the policy proposals when we put before him. But he took a more laissez-faire approach, and where we were essentially wanting inputs from him, that what are the political tolerance limits about these policy initiatives, or we are facing these problems in getting policies implemented, what initiative can you take in this? He took a more detached, hands-off view, and that was our problem. So we then, in many cases, had to then go to Bangabandhu, or he would take us to Bangabandhu, and we would then get backup from him. But had he been much more actively engaged in telling us what would be the political difficulties we would face in navigating a policy proposal through, for example, when we prepared a program for land reform, he did not discuss it with us when we presented it to him as our minister. So when we then directly took it up to Bangabandhu, he then told us that at this stage of the game, this is not a feasible proposition. ভবিষ্যতে কি হবে আমি দেখতে পারি এখানে. But at this stage, the people who are my elected representatives, they come from this same class, and the resources from the better off farmers are financing the education of their children in universities. So for me, after going through with the nationalization process, to go down this road would create practical problems for me, which I'm not ready to face now. But in future, we can see this problem, but at the moment, no.
So coming to Mrs. Hamida Hussein's question, if I understood it correctly, so the four of you, although you had been colleagues and friends for a long time, you were quite different in your outlooks. How did you reconcile that? And were there moments of tension within the team?
No, actually, it was very easy to resolve this because each went his own way. I mean, there was a territorial division within the Planning Commission, and each did what they thought they needed to do. Nurul Islam looked after the finance and macroeconomy. Musharraf looked after issues of agriculture and education and health. I looked after industries and infrastructure. And Anis, who was originally there, in a way just withdrew and would only just attend meetings and then write his own notes and memorandum for Bangabandhu. So now this in a way became one of the problems of the working of the Planning Commission, because all this had been coordinated. Nurul Islam was the person who was supposed to do the coordination, but he was willing to let each of us do their own thing. And to the extent that we went about in our own style, we each had a different impact in our own sector. I was the one who wanted to get involved in issues of implementation. None of my colleagues were at all interested in that part of the game. And Nurul Islam would back up whatever I said. He never would, I mean, he would tell me sometimes that I am a fool, or that I am, as usual, over-optimistic. He always thought I lived in a dream world, and I was over-optimistic about getting things done, and that over here nothing much could be done. But he was willing to then pass on all my proposals to Bangabandhu or the ministers concerned. And Musharraf, on the other hand, was much more willing to work within the system, and did it with superb efficiency. He had very good working relationships with all the bureaucrats, and he formulated policy proposals well. He prepared the plan very well. And Nurul Islam, of course, was responsible for macroeconomic policy advice, which he did, but a lot of that responsibility rested with the Ministry of Finance. So he let monetary policy making reside with the governor of the Bangladesh Bank and the finance minister and the finance secretary. He should have taken more interest in that, actually, as things turned out, but he left it to them.
And on this, your interest in pushing the implementation, one of the things that is difficult to do in a bureaucracy is step on someone else's toes, move into someone else's turf, because turf consciousness is a big thing in a bureaucracy. And I think one of the complaints against you is that you were often crossing your turf, the Planning Commission's turf, and going and interfering in the affairs of other ministries. But you're doing it because you thought the ministries were not implementing things fast enough.
Well, the real issue, in a way, was not with the Planning Commission. The real issue was between the bureaucrats and the professionals who were in charge of the particular sectors, say the nationalized industries. Now, I was obsessed with the notion that if we are going for this extensive nationalization process and extension of the public sector, we must make it work, because the whole future of a socialist agenda and the whole future of this regime, in a way, will depend on how effectively you could prove that under public ownership, you could run these industries efficiently, and more efficiently even than the private sector. It আমার strong belief ছিল, and একটা assumption ছিল. And I then had a very good working relationship with all the chairmen of the corporation, the managers of the enterprises, who all told me that if you give us full freedom of action and the autonomy to run these as commercial enterprises, but giving us the general direction, we can run these very efficiently. But if bureaucrats are sitting on our head, as was the case in Pakistan, and has happened in the nationalization experience in many other countries, then we can't do anything, because they will be exercising all sorts of constraints on our autonomy. And so I was then arguing their case with the bureaucrats and saying that give these people the liberty to function autonomously. And the big fight was to give complete autonomy to these people, which went on right up to the end of the regime. And when this was not happening, then we began using influence to try to facilitate giving them opportunity for independent action. I will give you an example. All the approaches of bureaucrats and everyone was not to make the enterprise efficient, but to get aid in order to then sort of support the system. And I found that there was huge capacities in all these areas where you could produce things yourself if you were going to give them small amounts of policy support and the autonomy to do it. And when this was not happening, we were using our control over aid resources to direct it to these enterprises. Naturally, the secretaries of the relevant ministries who were involved were not very happy with this, and so this became a problem. So this was the essential struggle, to liberate the professionals and give them the chance to run their enterprises and to be as autonomous as they could. And they said that we will work day and night to try and make these run efficiently, but you must give us the freedom to do so. So this is what I was fighting with them. I'll give you one example you had wanted, the famous cement case.
Yes.
I went to, what was the, not Ashuganj, the one, Chatok, yes. I went to Chatok I was going all over the place to see how these enterprises were working and what problems they faced. So when I went to Chatok, I found that the general manager there was a very competent person, and he had restored production to pre-liberation levels. But I found huge quantities of cement lying over there. And I said, what the hell is all this cement lying over here? There's a massive shortage of cement across the country. They said, we cannot market the cement. It is within the control of the Ministry of Commerce. Ministry of Commerce permits the way to this and that person, and then the cement will be taken and given to them. And so the Ministry of Commerce was using this as a form of patronage to give it to party supporters and to other people, and that is how this was moving very slowly. So I was very irritated with that. Then I went across the river. There they were building a big paper mill under aid program. Over there I found that the Germans were building this paper mill, but Onik machinery was lying out in the open as the construction was going on. So I said, Ekhon to monsoon is about to come. Why are you leaving all this machinery in the open? They said, cement nai. So I said that Ekhene Nadiye Roipare, you have got huge piles of cement. Ekhene machinery noshto hocche because there is no cement to build it. So I went across the river and I said, on my own authority, and I wrote down on a slip of paper, you transfer as much cement and sell it to these people across the river, which they did actually. So unar problem solve holo, ekene problem solve holo. When I went back, I wrote a note to the Minister of Commerce that I have exceeded my authority. Member Planning Commission has no authority to order a factory manager to sell his cement to someone else. And I said that these are the circumstances in which I had done it. I get a note later on, a complaint is sent by the Secretary of Commerce to Bangabandhu that Member Planning Commission has exceeded his authority and this is very unfortunate, etc., which was of course the case. So then when I met Bangabandhu and I explained the situation to him, he said, well, এটা তো সমস্যা তুমি ভালো করেছো, but then please do not try to exceed your authority in the future. But আমি তো সব সময়, because I was wanting things to get done, I was going out of my way to then see that things on the ground were done, and the factory managers and the chairman of corporation were then coming to me to solve their problems, even though the problem-solving issue lay with the secretary and with the minister. But I felt that unless we could make these sectors work and to make them operational, this would be a political price which would be paid by the regime, and this would be a price which would be paid by the commitment to a sort of strong state sector which we associated with socialism.
My last question will be a follow-up on that, but I have one more before that. So when you went to the socialist countries, you were expecting some concessions. You thought, after all, there will be a strong sense of socialist solidarity. And to your surprise, you found the bureaucrats to be very, very hard-nosed. No sign of solidarity there, no concessions.
Well, I found no socialists in any socialist country. That was my first interesting experience. I went to Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and East Germany. I went with Mr. Abdus Samad Azad because the idea was that we wanted to diversify our economic relationships and dependence on the US and the Western countries and to then see what opportunities existed. So Amar Bishas chilo, these were all highly motivated people who believed in solidarity between socialism and third world countries. But what I found were that at the governmental level, no one was very interested in talking about socialism. They were not interested in that. Huge conversation would take place in the first meeting between Mr. Abdus Samad Azad as foreign minister and his counterpart in the country event. And then everyone would talk about solidarity between the third world and between the socialist countries and so on and so forth. Then when I would go and sit down for the negotiations and discussion, that what trade can take place, what aid can we expect from you. Then it was all business. And essentially, they were interested in giving us commercial loans at 5-6% for buying their equipment. And my experience then was that you needed some very hard negotiations, and then only would they bring down their rate of interest. So, in some cases, when in Romania, I had to go and meet with the late and President Ceausescu himself to persuade him to actually get his officials to reduce rates of interest from 6% to about 3%, which he actually did for us at that time. But everywhere you went with hard-nosed Bibshahis, who were basically thinking this was a responsibility of theirs, and they had no strong commitment to notion of a special solidarity between these particular countries. That was my experience over there. It was an interesting experience. And of course, the big problem was then to get the ministries and the operational agencies to accept socialist aid. They all assumed that socialist aid is quality kharab hobe. So therefore, they had got used to getting American aid and US aid and European aid at these times. And the notion then that we should then be trying to push socialist assistance on them was being strongly resisted.
So my last question, well, obviously, it was challenging for the four of you in the Planning Commission to deal with this complex machinery of the insiders, including the political ministers who may have been outsiders, but they thought they had, of course, been elected. They were people's representatives and had a certain authority. Someone who had worked with you in the Planning Commission had once remarked to me, he said, Akhtar, do you know what was the real problem with the four professors? I said, what? He said the professors wanted the power of the politician, but also the insulation of the technocrat. So you did not want to play the dirty game of negotiations and all of that wheeling and dealing. You wanted the insulation of a technocrat, and yet you wanted the power of a politician. Was that a fair assessment?
That would have been a reasonably fair assessment, I would say. But there was a reason for that. And the reason for that was we frequently had this debate. This was one of the issues we did debate amongst ourselves, that should we go out and interact more openly to persuade both other ministers and to persuade politicians of influence in the party about the issues that we were pursuing. And the argument, this was my position, I wanted very strongly to do that. But the argument which was given, and strangely enough it was given by Professor Musharraf Hussain, who was the most politically oriented amongst all of us actually, that if we do this, this will not be acceptable to our immediate political superiors, which happen to be Bangabandhu, because our line of command and our line of relationship was directly with him. And any interaction that was to take place would only be done through him. The notion that we will autonomously build up political constituency support may not be acceptable. Now, we never quite tested Musharraf's hypothesis, but that is the way we operated. And I think it had, in my view, in retrospect now, it was really a wrong policy. And that had you wanted to push a radical line, then you needed to build political support. And at the end of the day, you needed to become politicians, actually. It wasn't simply enough to go and argue your case. You would have to join the party, build up autonomous support within the party to, in fact, carry these ideas through. The notion that you will just be professionals operating through a chain of command and that you will then push through radical ideas without conscientizing your constituencies, this was not a very wise idea, and I would certainly accept that.
And of course, what I learned from Professor Islam is that Bangabandhu actually asked him to contest the elections, I think the 1973.
Eventually he wanted
yes,
him to,
and
yes.
of course you would expect Professor Islam to be very nervous at that proposition.
No.
So he didn't quite accept it, but that I think was the logic. I mean, the reason I probed into this, because this is not only about an historical interest of that period. We do expect people from outside the bureaucracy and the political class to come and serve in government. And when they do, there will be this outsider-insider dynamic. So there's a lot to learn from your experience for any future outsider who finds himself or herself within the government.
Well, to conclude that point, you see, the big problem with bureaucrats is at the end of the day, they are reluctant to get into confrontation with their political masters in a democratic system, not in the Ayub system. And the tendency, therefore, to rationalize what your minister wants is very strong and is part of the bureaucrat's survival strategy. Our issue was that we were very free to speak our mind. And if we disagreed with them, we said so. And if we had problems with what we were doing, we pointed this out, both to them when we met them in writing, and then with Bangabandhu. Now, this coming from us was not something which was very comfortable for senior bureaucrats in particular. That we have various constraints, because this is our career, and if we want to retain our career, then we have to be very careful. Here these people come in. Every one of us was quite ready to leave our position if in fact we had serious differences of opinion. And so this gave us a certain sort of autonomy in the way we expressed ourselves and in positions we took. So we did not feel any need to compromise on issues. Now, this is all very well if you are functioning as a free-thinking individual, but if you're operating within a political government, there are problems, and certainly we face some of those consequences.
Okay, so we will just open up the floor for maybe 10 minutes, Maru, 10 or 15, because we are way beyond our time. We'll start with the young man over there who wanted to ask a question.
Hello, hello. Wait, okay. Hi, Assalamu alaikum, sir. I'm Abrar Jawad, and I'm currently a student in high school, but I'll be starting my university education at Brown, like starting like this fall. So I think I just wanted to share it's more of a comment. I want to start off with a comment and end with a question. I wanted to share the story of like how I am here right now. It's like today morning I happened to tell my father like there's a book talk at UPL with Rehman Sobhan sir, and like I just saw his face pop up with excitement, and he was like, "Look, this is Rehman Sobhan sir. This is the most like he's one of the most brilliant thinkers in Bangladesh right now, and like you should definitely meet him. Like it's going to be a once in a lifetime opportunity for you, maybe, but you should definitely take this chance and don't miss it." So we actually had a lunch invitation today. And when I got to know that this is like you're going to be talking today, he pushed it back to like for dinner. And then like right now, like I went outside to make a call, and he's a little late to home right now. Just take your time. We'll extend the dinner later. We'll go later on. It's fine, but you have like let him finish his talk. So that's one thing. And the question that I wanted to ask is like. There's so many people here, and I think like there's I see very few people like myself like of such an age, and I think as someone who's just about to like start their academic education, like all of you have probably completed your academic like life, and or maybe you still are continuing it, and I'm just started in that, and so I decided that and part of the reason for that was because I believe I can probably best impact to this field. So hearing your story was actually very inspiring, because I every step of the way, like from the at least from the first part, like your formation of like your life and how you began your journey, it was very inspiring for me because like every step, like try to see myself in that scenario, and like if I could ever be in that position, if I could ever like actually take the steps that you took. And well, I mean, I hope someday I might actually be able to, because like after today, like I think you have actually become one of my role models. But the question I wanted to ask you is, so what was it for you that made you want to like start, like, or made you think that economics is the way to go, like, or what actually led you to and become one of the prominent thinkers of our. Thank you.
Hope you at least are not late for dinner. Huh? I hope you are not late for dinner. Okay, and please convey my appreciation to your father for encouraging you to come here, but you in particular, that you've chosen to actually come here and take an interest in this. Actually, if you're going to Brown, by the way, don't expect that they will encourage you to go down the road that I went when I was at Cambridge. You will have to learn a lot of mathematics, and you will have to then get their perspective on what constitutes macroeconomics, which will be taking you very far away from the type of economics which I learnt and then attempted to practice over here. But you have an independent mind, obviously, and it will teach you sort of good techniques of understanding it. But keep in mind that if you want to be a different sort of economist, then you have to be much more involved with what is going on in the world around you. The world of the macroeconomist is a very narrow world. Always keep that in mind. But good luck to you.
I'll
And
just
enjoy
add,
your dinner.
I read somewhere about Lord Keynes, and he apparently said that the thing about economics is not necessarily the theories that you learn, but the way it makes you think, the way a training in economics makes you think about various issues. And that's something you may just want to remember. We'll take a question from you and then from you. But let that young gentleman there ask a question.
Sir, I'm Haris Rahman. I'm a final year law student in University of Asia Pacific, sir. Sir, my question is, many people hide some significant part or story in their biography. So do you have any kind of, do you have anything like that which you want to share right now with us? Thank you, sir.
Did that what?
Sometimes people don't write certain things in their autobiographies.
Oh.
So is there something like that which isn't in any of these two volumes that you want to mention?
Oh, well, I don't know. I suppose there must be many things, but I tried to put down everything that I thought of public interest. I mean, a lot of autobiographies are written giving a lot of personal details about life. I thought that my readers may not be interested in that. So there's a lot I could say about that, but এই সময়ের মধ্যে তো সময় কোথায়? But as a general principle, there are two sorts of autobiographies, and one is very personalized, and I didn't quite go down that road. May have been more interesting. I've had many interesting things to say.
We'll just take two more questions, one from here and then from the second row. Please.
My name is Babon. I hope you remember me.
I do indeed. A slimmer version of you, anyway.
A better version. A better version. Years have done me. Years have done me a lot of harm. I happen to be about the only other person in this room who worked with you in those crucial days, 72 to 75, and I was on the other side of the table, the Ministry of Finance. And while I appreciate your recollections of your struggles in the Planning Commission, I have a different version of it, naturally, being in the Ministry of Finance. My only regret is I hope this is being recorded. I asked Maharov right in the beginning that I hope you're recording this, because there's more to this than what people would just read in the book. there are only two other people alive, fortunately, who should really put their memories to paper about that period. One is Moti Bhai, still alive, close to 100.
Moti.
Motiul Islam.
He did actually do that. He has written a memoir.
Which is actually, I would have liked to have somebody compare your thoughts with his about the struggle of the Planning Commission and the Ministry of Finance. And the other one is Said Usman's.
Wow.
And I've tried to persuade him to put something on paper because that crucial for 3 years is known to only these handful of people. I was a small wheel in the Ministry of Finance at that time. And I also remember all the problems we had. And you were just one floor above, so I had often to go and meet you. But the way I remember it is a little different. And it all stems from the enormous lack of resources that we had. The struggle to allocate resources, the struggle to reformulate what the Pakistanis had left for us, or what the World Bank, the masters of finance in the World Bank, were forcing us to accept. It's not always recorded everywhere. And I didn't see it in other people's memoirs. And I don't know how much of that, although I have some records, how much of that I can put to paper. But this tussle between the Ministry of Finance and the Planning Commission is something that I recorded, particularly because I was then in charge of the foreign exchange project, which of course you know the cash foreign exchange project was handled by us. About your issues with the cement, the problem was that we had set up TCB. It's not the ministry which was handling the allocation of cement. It was TCB, an autonomous body set
No,
up.
TCB was under the Ministry of Commerce.
Correct. But it was TCB which was controlling the allocation of cement. And I also had to run around trying to get cement, milk powder, if you remember correctly. I remember
many other things.
And many other things. I remember my finance secretary sitting in the morning and making a list, to my horror, making a list of the items he required. So those are days which people in these days just can't imagine what it was like in early 72, right into 73. But I would request you and others in UPL to try and persuade Said Usman sir and Matul sir. Often Muhammad sir is gone. But the two of them to really put their thoughts and their recollections to paper. That would be a fairly...
Because you have obviously not seen this. I had myself not many dealings with the Ministry of Finance, but the person who did and who has written extensively on this is Nurul Islam. He's written one exclusively on the planning experience that he had, his first volume, 2 memoirs, and a 4th volume on the aid relationship. So as far as you are concerned, if you really want a view of the financial world in the relationship between planning and finance ministry, you read Nurul Islam's memoirs. It will cover a lot of ground. Said-ur-Zaman may add to that, if he adds to that, but I don't think anyone would have written as comprehensively as Nurul Islam has actually done. And you should definitely read it.
I will.
Okay. And as far as the TCB is concerned, the big problem was that TCB, like other of these organizations, all eventually functioned under the authority of the secretary. So it wasn't that the chairman or director of TCB would take the final decision on the cement permits. It would be taken at the secretariat level.
But I find it hard to believe that a man like Nurul Islam would have written a letter like it would have been somebody else. Nurul Islam was the secretary, Commerce. The other Nurul Islam.
No, at that time, he's just passed away, unfortunately. It was Mafizur Rahman.
Well, anyway, I think he was capable of writing a letter.
Sir, I have a question.
I think, Rodney, I'm sorry, but we'll just take one more question. You had a chance in the last round, but let's take just one more question because we are way beyond.
Assalamu alaikum. Akhtar bhai, it was a wonderfully moderated session. I think one of the best moderated session that we've had for some time. আচ্ছা স্যার, আমার কাছে এখন একটা পারপ্লেক্সিং কোয়েশ্চেন লাগছে যে 10% অফ দি ইন্ডাস্ট্রি লোকাল এন্টারপ্রেনারদের ছিল। আপনি বলছেন যে হিস্টোরিক্যালি মুক্তিযুদ্ধের পরে যে সিচুয়েশনটা ছিল, আচ্ছা, 2টা ব্যাংক ছিল অ্যান্ড আইপিডিসি যেসব ফ্যাক্টরি করেছিল সেগুলি ছিল। তো এখন আপনি বলছেন যে হিস্টোরিক রিয়েলিটি অফ মুক্তিযুদ্ধ, যেখানে আপনার সব নন বেঙ্গলিরাই ছিল এবং তারা চলে গেছে, সো ইউ গাইজ হ্যাড নো অপশন বাট টু এটা সরকারি খাতে নিয়ে যাওয়া। কিন্তু একটা প্রশ্ন হচ্ছে যে 10% যারা ছিল, মানে তারা তো ছিল, তাদেরকে আমরা নিলাম কেন? মানে এটাতে আসলে লাভ কি হলো? বিকজ ওরা তো ছিলই। আর আরেকটা জিনিস ছিল যে যারা ম্যানেজ করতো, আইপিডিসির সময় তো একটা প্রফেশনাল ক্লাস ছিল। 71-এর পরে আমরা দেখলাম যে ওই আইপিডিসিটাকে ভাগ ভাগ করে ফেলা হলো, সবগুলি টেক্সটাইল আলাদা, সব আলাদা আলাদা করা হলো। সো সেন্ট্রাল যে একটা প্রফেশনাল ক্লাস হায়ার করার ছিল সেটা চলে গেল। মানে আমি জানি না কিভাবে আসলে, আচ্ছা, মানে আমার কাছে প্রশ্নটা হচ্ছে যে এই বাংলাদেশি কোম্পানি, বাংলাদেশি ওন কোম্পানিগুলিকেও নিয়ে নেওয়ার পরে হোয়াট ওয়াজ দ্য প্ল্যান যে এই 90% যারা ছিল তারা ম্যানেজ করবে কি? এটার প্ল্যানটা আসলে কী ছিল, যে এটার ম্যানেজের ক্লাস কী হবে? এবং আমরা যখন আপনার ইয়েতেই আসলো সিমেন্টের ব্যাপারে, যখন দেশের ক্লাইমেটটাই ছিল পারমিট, দ্যাট ওয়াজ দ্য পলিটিক্যাল ক্লাইমেট, যে পারমিটের মাধ্যমে পুরো জিনিসটা মানে চলে যাচ্ছে, তখন রেসপন্সটা কি ছিল আপনাদের দিক থেকে যে এটা আসলে ম্যানেজ করবে কারা, এই পাবলিক এন্টারপ্রাইজগুলি?
ওয়েল, অ্যাকচুয়ালি আমার তো একটা 600 পেজের একটা বই আছে অন দ্যাট, in which one of the chapters examines in detail who managed. And actually, most of the people who managed were professional people. Many were drawn from the PIDC cadres who were already managing. A number of people were brought in from the private sector. We looked around at private sector who are some of the most competent managers, and we brought them in. In fact, Itihashik, the management of the PIDC had always been with a senior bureaucrat. One of our first juddhos was that we wanted all these corporations to be managed by professional people. So either they would be senior people from the PIDC or they would be people from the private sector. And we have analyzed not just the chief executives who were appointed, but also the directors of finance and others, the technical directors. Great majority were all professional people. Only a very small handful of people ke bola jay ki uni ekhon ekta political patronage er moddhe ana gelo. The whole belief for a long time was that immediately after nationalization they handed it over to Awami Leaguers and they then destroyed it. Ekkebar nonsense. It was all professional people, and for the first time, senior professional people were given responsibility for the corporations. This was one of the problems we faced with the bureaucrats, which they do that. Secondly, ঝগড়া ছিল how much autonomy you would give them. কি তুমি permit রাজের মধ্যে যাবো তো কিচ্ছু হবে না. So my fight was that no, you should give these people both the production and marketing rights. You should let them market it within the framework of the market. যদি তুমি কোনো ক্লাসকে সাহায্য করতে চাও, do it through a separate subsidy. তুমি প্রতিষ্ঠানকে নষ্ট করো না. Let them work efficiently and on commercial principle. That was the central element of the argument. এসব সব আমার ওই exactly what we did, কোন পেপার লিখেছে, কি কোথাও গেছে, we have put it all in that volume on public enterprise that we wrote over there. But the notion that you are trying to suggest that professional chilo na, that was not correct. This was the first time in the history of Pakistan that professionals were actually given senior management responsibilities to run these organizations. So it actually should.
I would, sorry, no. I just, no, I'll actually go to Ronnie also in recognition of the enormous work he does to encourage the discourses on economics in Bangladesh. So the last question to Ronnie.
Sir, my question is very small. In economics, we know that we cannot have all these things at the same time. If we want certain thing, we have to give up another thing. So you have a rare experience of planning and implementing what Bangladesh once dreamed for. Dreamed for an independence, dreamed for a independent state. So, so what was your actually priority? Was your priority to reduce disparity or inequality, or was your priority to give liberty to the individuals? So there is a trade-off between liberty and reducing disparity or inequality in the society. What was actually priority at the stage of planning and at the stage of implementing?
এটা তো philosophical প্রশ্ন, which I don't accept anyway, that there is a contradiction between reducing inequality and giving liberty, because much really depends on the nature of liberty and how that liberty is then used. I mean, if you want to reduce inequality, then you also have to create opportunities for all sorts of deprived people to exercise their own freedom of opportunity. যে বলে লিবার্টি কি লিমিট সীমিত লোককে লিবার্টি দেওয়া যায় এখানে to do whatever they like, that is unacceptable and that will create inequality. But that's a philosophical question. So আমার যে প্রায়োরিটি ছিল এটা তো কোনো অসুবিধা নেই ওখানে।
অনলাইনে একটা প্রশ্ন আছে ফ্রম মিল্লাত হোসেন। স্যারের কাছে আমার একটি ছোট্ট প্রশ্ন ছিল, ৭০-এর নির্বাচনে জয়ী আওয়ামী লীগ একটি ড্রাফট সংবিধান রচনা করার কথা সংশ্লিষ্টদের বিভিন্ন মেমোয়ারে পাওয়া যায়, এটা কোথায় আছে, এখনো কি কোথাও পাওয়া যাবে? So
the draft constitution?
No. I think he's saying that the work that Awami League did on a draft constitution, there are references to that in people's memoirs. I mean, both you and Professor Nurul Islam has written about the discussions on a possible constitution, but that was before the elections, when Bangabandhu had that retreat with you all.
No, but that was basically centered around the operationalization of 6 points. That was the issue at that time. That you would be writing a constitution for an independent Bangladesh was a completely different order of things, and for that, a constitutional commission was set up post-liberation by Bangabandhu with Kamal Hussein as the sort of coordinator of that group. And that was a very extensive exercise which went on with detailed debates taking place. Professor Anisuzzaman has written extensively on that, apart from whatever Kamal Hussein has written.
Because he was involved, I think.
He was involved as the translator, but he was also involved then in the discussions as well, like with witness to the discussions. So he's got a very interesting account of that.
Right. Maharu, can I just have just one more to the gentleman here?
Mahmood, I asked you this question earlier. Following the killing of Bangabandhu, along with his family, given your background, your commitment to liberation, and your involvement, how did you see Bangladesh 10 or 20 years down the road? And how do you see it today in terms of government leadership and well, that's about all.
Sorry, you had asked that question before, and I said we'll hold it to the end.
Yeah. Okay. Well, as far as the first question is concerned, I remember when we came back, we decided to leave the country after the killing of Bangabandhu, and we were away in Oxford. When I came back, the country I came back to looked quite a lot like Ayub's Pakistan, I must say, at that time. And Bangabandhu had effectively been whitewashed out of the history of Bangladesh. So you lived in a country for almost 20, how many years it was, where his name was barely mentioned. And all those historical episodes in which he was central to that had effectively been erased. So that was the world which had come into existence. Now, what is interesting, of course, is that there has been an attempt to compensate for that, and now the present system is reviving and regenerating that memory. On the other hand, of course, the philosophy guiding that, particularly the economic philosophy guiding that, is very much at variance with what Bangabandhu aspired to. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that the country and the economy in particular has done very well in quite a number of areas. It would be very foolish to suggest otherwise. But the process through which all this has come about would certainly not be consistent with the philosophical premise of Bangabandhu's ideas of what he expected would be the direction for Bangladesh, which means essentially that country has developed in many areas. It has only done so following an alternative direction in terms of its economic agenda.
How do you see 10 years down the road?
10 years down the road is a very long time in our history. And I would see, if you project the present trends, it would be a very unequal society by that time. It would be a better off society in terms of aggregate growth and the diversification of the economy, but it would be a very unequal society, and you would see that projected in terms of the political character of that society, which has now become increasingly dominated and controlled by people who in fact have the resources to exercise that power. So it is economic power has now been transferred into political power, and political power is being used to perpetuate economic power. That is the nature of the society, which is actually very contrary to the vision of Bangabandhu. But that doesn't mean that an alternative vision may not be a viable vision.
So we'll end with the last question, which I'm sure is on many people's mind. When can we have a discussion on your third volume?
Well, my challenge is that it is almost done, and I will try to hand it over to Maruk in the next 2 months. Then it will be up to her.
Okay. And that will take us to the present times?
Down to our present conversation.
Oh, okay, wonderful. So, well, thank you very much. And Maharuk and UPL team, we took much longer than you had planned, so thanks for your indulgence. But I think you enjoyed this conversation, so thank you very much, Professor Sobhan. Can we have a standing ovation for him?
Oh. Well, I would like a standing ovation for Akhtar for the excellent questions he asked. Thank you. Thank you, sir.